Can I welcome everyone to the 13th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019 and remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones. Agenda item 1 is consideration of whether to take agenda item 3 in private. Item 3 is consideration of a draft letter to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee on the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. Are we all agreed? Thank you. That is agreed. Agenda item 2. The committee will consider the non-domestic rates bill at stage 2. I welcome Kate Forbes, Minister for Public Finance and Digital Economy, to talk and move amendments on behalf of the Scottish Government. I also welcome her officials. I now call Amendment 1 in the name of Andy Whiteman. Oh, sorry. The question is that Section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. I now call Amendment 1 in the name of Andy Whiteman, grouped with Amendments 5 and 84. Andy Whiteman to move Amendment 1 and speak to all amendments in the group.
I move Amendment 1. Thanks, Convener. This group of 3 amendments deals with 2 distinct issues. Prior to 1956, there were owners' rates and there were occupiers' rates, and currently the liability for rates rests with the occupier. What Amendment 1 does is it transfers that liability to the owner, who is the party that ultimately benefits from the services provided by local authorities and the state more widely in protecting and providing the necessary amenities and infrastructure that generates the value for the owner and the prospect of a return by way of rent. And locating the owner is easier than the occupier, and a charge can be secured against property for unpaid rates if necessary. So that's Amendment 1.
Andy, want to take an intervention?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, could I just ask, you've just said tracing the owner is easier than tracing the occupier. How do you work that out?
Because the owners are all on a public record.
Doesn't mean they're easy to trace.
Well, they're all on the public record. You can inspect that public record and find out who the owner is, and if necessary, take a charge against the property. So Amendments 5 and 82 deal with a different problem. The committee will recall hearing evidence of Phoenix companies. These are companies that occupy non-domestic property. They appear and disappear and prevent challenges for the recovery of unpaid rates. We also heard from Brian Morrison, Revenue Manager of Highland Council, about shell companies as occupiers who, in evidence, he argued collectively owe around £2 million in unpaid rates across Scotland. Given that the occupier can disappear but the owner can't, it seems reasonable to make provision in defined circumstances where there are difficulties in securing the payment of rates from an occupier to secure the liability instead from the owner. Now, on an initial reading of Section 16 of the 1956 Act, of the Valuation and Rating Scotland Act, it might appear that councils already have this power. So where they can't chase the occupier, they do have the power to chase the owner. But I read that as a savings provision applicable only in the immediate aftermath of the abolition of owners' rates then. So I initially lodged Amendment 5 to provide guidance on Section 16, but I'd seek the committee's consent to withdraw Amendment 5. And Amendment 84 does the job, really. This provides that any council that's unable to recover rates from the occupier has the opportunity to recover them from the owner. And the regulations will set out the specific circumstances for this. And as I say, the intention behind this amendment is not to provide a very wide power to collect rates from owners, but only in those defined circumstances where it proves ultimately impossible to recover them from the occupier, and those circumstances would be set out in regulations. And this seems, Convener, to be a proportionate and a sensible response to a real problem that was identified by witnesses. Yep.
Thank you. Was this, not that I recall it was, but was this part of the Barclay proposals? I don't remember us discussing this.
No, as I recall, Barclay didn't identify this. I mean, as I recall, when this came up in committee first time, I think committee members were rather surprised. I think this was the first time they'd perhaps heard this. Now, as to why Barclay didn't look at it, I don't know. Barclay, of course, had a very narrow remit. Perhaps that helped to explain. But anyway, as I say, this is, I think, a very proportionate and sensible response, Amendment 84, to a real problem, and I ask members to give it serious consideration. Thanks, Convener.
Very much, Kenneth. You want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, just actually following on from what Annabelle said, I mean, I don't actually think that we should be supporting this number 1 amendment at all. I mean, for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't accept that it's easier. It might be easier to know who the owner is, but certainly in my constituency, there's been difficulties in trying to get owners to repair buildings because they live in the Republic of Ireland, Isle of Man, etc. Also, we are trying to bring forward the recommendations of the Bartley Review. This wasn't one of them. It wasn't even considered by it. And to actually bring in such a monumental change at this stage, I think, is wholly inappropriate, and we haven't really taken any evidence on it.
Okay, thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, I'm very interested in the anti-avoidance measure that's set out in 84. And it's also been raised with me as an issue, where people deliberately avoid paying their non-domestic rates and how local authorities can actually chase them. And I've also got an amendment in it, 101, which is much later in the bill, which would come up later today. So I'm very keen to support the principle behind the amendments, because I think it should be important that local authorities have got the powers to avoid people evading these taxes, and that we should send a clear message from our discussions in the process of shaping the bill that that's unacceptable. So I'm kind of interested in getting the Minister and Andy's take on the difference between my amendments in terms of their effectiveness and 84. So my amendment is 101 and Andy's is 84. I think
Minister will have a chance to speak.
yeah, that's what, but I'm saying this now. I wanted to flag that up in advance, that I would like the Minister to comment. So I'm kind of interested in the different approaches, and not just, obviously, the Minister and Andy Whiteman, if any other members have got views on it, obviously. But that was my intention. I think it's trying to do the same thing, but I'd be interested in people's views on it. Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Alexander?
I have some similar views about Amendment 1, Convener, as to what we really heard from members of the committee, that it is very difficult in some circumstances to ensure that the owner has the pure liability. I mean, we've have numerous situations where we have buildings that have fallen into disrepair and the owner may be out with the country and it takes years for that blot on the landscape to be managed within that community to ensure that that takes place. So I would have some real difficulty with the Amendment 1 on this situation with regard to that.
Graham.
Thanks, Convener. So in relation to these amendments, I was struck by a quite late submission that we had last night from the Scottish Property Federation. It mentioned, it really made the point that this would be a fundamental change in the business relationship between owners of properties and people who lease those properties. So you sign a lease, and that lease makes you can and it usually does make you liable to pay non-domestic rates, water rates, etc. And they gave a figure that in the past year there's been over, well, just under 4,000 new lease transactions in Scotland. So that suggests that there could be tens of thousands of leases that could be impacted by this change. As I'm not quite, I'm almost finished actually. I'm just making that point that I think this will be a fundamental change and may have unintended consequences.
Thank you. Minister.
Thanks very much. I'll speak to the point around the fundamental change and then to the substance of the amendments. So members are right that this reform which wasn't considered by Barclay, would mark a substantial move away from the system that has been in place since 1956. And the consequences of that move have not been assessed nor have they been scrutinised by Parliament. And there are a number of big questions, such as could making owners liable in some cases actually increase rates avoidance, or would councils find it easy to recover rates on properties that are in foreign properties? Those questions need to be answered, I think, before we make such a substantial move away from the rate system as we know it. In terms of the substance of the amendments, Amendment 1, I do think there's certainly merit in the notion that councils may benefit from additional tools to tackle rates avoidance, and we're a firm supporter of, yeah.
There's been a lack of clarity from members when they're talking about amendments as to which one they're talking about. You just mentioned Amendment 1 there in relation to avoidance. I think you mean 84.
I mean your first amendment.
Amendment 1. Okay.
So your first amendment is transferring the rates liability on a property to the owner rather than the occupier. And I think that, I mean, one of the benefits that you identified in speaking to that was that it would enable councils to benefit from additional tools to tackle rates avoidance. No?
Well, if I'm just to take an intervention.
Yeah.
It's Amendment 4 that's designed to provide the tools to tackle not so much avoidance, but the situation that was highlighted to us in committee by two separate witnesses, millions of pounds of rates not being collected because they could not, because companies were formed, wound up, formed, wound up, formed, wound up. So 84 is about providing the opportunity in limited circumstances to be able to get it from the owner. Amendment 1 is fundamentally different, and that completely changes the whole non-domestic rate system.
Yeah.
So it's important that we understand the
No,
big
that's helpful
distinction.
clarity.
Yep.
And I suppose I was merely separating the fact that the Amendment 1 would, as you say, substantially change the rate system. I think one of the merits that are identified for doing that is being able to tackle rates avoidance. So I was merely making that connection, but I appreciate that clarity. So from that perspective, I wouldn't be able to support Amendment 1 because it's such a substantial change that I think needs to be scrutinised before we were to go down that route. I won't speak to Amendment 5 unless the member wants me to, because he's not going to press it. In terms of 84, which allows councils to recover rates from the owner of a property where they're unable to do so from the occupier, it's unclear to me from drafting whether the council would have full discretion of this power or whether that should be subjected to regulations that the amendment also allows Scottish ministers to pass to make further provision about the circumstances in which a council may do that. And as mentioned, convener, we are a firm believer in tackling avoidance, and that's why Part 4 of the bill provides Scottish ministers with the power to propose regulations to prevent or minimise advantages that arise from, and I quote, artificial non-domestic rates avoidance arrangements. And the bill requires that we consult on those regulations with assessors and local authority representatives, which would therefore subject them to greater input from those who administer the system than an amendment to the bill. To Sarah Boyack's question, Amendment 101 is narrower in that it only talks about the recovery of rates paid when arrangements subsequently are made unlawful by our general anti-avoidance regulations.
Minister, for that, and just say that normally we don't speak to amendments that we haven't reached yet, but thanks for clarity on that point. Andy Whiteman to wind up and press or withdraw.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to put on the record because some members didn't say which amendment they were talking about. Amendment 1 is a fundamental change. I accept to the rating system, and I don't think there's support in committee for that, and that's as may be. I don't accept Mr Gibson's argument that this wasn't in Barclay. I mean, the whole point is this is a non-domestic rate bill. It's the only one we've had in 20 years. It's probably the only one we'll get for another 20 years. Barclay was defined in extremely narrow terms. It asked one question of consultees, one question. And this is the opportunity for Parliament to be able to amend the non-domestic rating regime more generally, if it so chooses to do so. As I say, I'm seeking to withdraw Amendment 4, but I may come back to that in light of Amendment 5. I apologise, yeah. But I may come back to that in light of whatever happens with Amendment 84, because whilst the Minister correctly says that Part 4 of the bill deals with anti-avoidance, that's about avoiding artificial arrangements. And that's good. There's no problem with that. Amendment 84 deals with a very specific problem highlighted to the committee in evidence by two separate witnesses, one a professional valuer, the other the head of revenues of a local authority, making it very clear that in circumstances where occupiers are either so-called Phoenix companies or, in the case of Highland Council's evidence, where they are so-called shell companies, typically Scottish Limited Partnerships, and the director is ultimately found to be an elderly gentleman in Edinburgh who didn't even know they're a director, and they cannot recover these rates. It seems appropriate in those circumstances, in those defined circumstances, to give councils the power to seek that recovery from the owner. And to answer the Minister's question in respect of regulations, that there may be some drafting adjustments to be done here, but my intention here is that the circumstances in which councils would have the power, and how that power could be exercised would be set out in regulations. What Amendment 84 makes clear is that they do have that power. And I've put Amendment 84 in, as I say, because Section 16 of the 1956 Act, I read it as a saving provision, but advice I took suggested it could be read as a continuing power that councils still have to recover rates from owners. If that's the case, then it's not very well defined, and therefore, for the avoidance of all doubt, I don't want to rely on what drafters might have thought intended in 1956. I'm inserting a new section into... Yep.
Just to confirm that I agree with the sentiment, which may not be in great consolation, of Amendment 84. The point I was trying to make is that I'd far rather go down the consultative route, particularly with assessors and local authority representatives having an input for considering whether to provide local councils with the additional powers. I recognise that Andy Whiteman wants to do a formal amendment, but I certainly agree with the thrust of his amendment. I just don't think an amendment's the right way to do it. I'd rather go down the consultative route for clarity.
I thank the Minister for that comment. I mean, the consultative route, I mean, this is a bill. This is the only legislative opportunity we probably have for another 20 years. I'm very happy for there to be consultation on this, and that wouldn't be difficult to organise between now and stage 3. And certainly I'm very happy to consider amendments to this amendment that would subject the regulations to consultation. I don't see any conflict between the intention of this amendment and the need for consultation. Insofar as the regulations that would give effect to this and the commencement date can be set, etc., can all be, and indeed I agree, should be subject to consultation. I'd be very happy to look at that at stage 3. That's I agree with that. But if we don't get a provision into the bill at this stage, then we'll never have this opportunity. And this was clear evidence of, I wouldn't say avoidance. Well, it is avoidance in the case of shell companies. They are intentionally winding themselves up, disappearing as legal entities, obviously have no further liability for rates because there is no legal person around. And this is a clear problem identified by councils, and I think we as Parliament have got a duty to do as much as we can to provide a remedy in these limited circumstances where this problem arises. Thanks, Convener.
Much. I ask you present or withdrawing?
Sorry.
Amendment 1.
I press Amendment 1.
Okay. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Those in favour of Amendment 1? Those opposed to Amendment 1? 1 in favour, 5 opposed. The amendment therefore 6 opposed. Early in the morning. My apologies. Call Amendment 5 in the name of Andy Whiteman, already debated with Amendment 1. Andy Whiteman, to move or not move?
See, the committee's not move. Not move.
Thank you. The question, the Amendment 5 was not moved. I call Amendment 84 in the name of Andy Whiteman, already debated with Amendment 1. Andy Whiteman, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 84 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Those in favour of Amendment 4? That's 2. Those opposed to Amendment 84? That's 5. Amendment 84 is not agreed to. The question is that Section 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yep. Section 2 is agreed to. Thank you. I call Amendment 6 in the name of Andy Whiteman and a group on its own. Andy Whiteman, to move and speak to Amendment 6.
Thanks very much, Convener. As the committee is aware, recommendation 28 of the Barclay review was that all property should be entered on the valuation roll with the exception of public infrastructure, such as roads, bridges and sewers. A key argument for this recommendation is that a key argument for bringing things onto the roll is because at the moment, with things being exempted, certain subjects being exempted, there's no information at all about the value associated with these properties and therefore the revenue foregone and the costs incurred by such exemptions. So, for example, a £1 million a year agricultural operation on the edge of a small town is completely exempt from contributing to local authority revenue, whilst the schools, the pubs, the shops and the cafes in the local town are all on the roll and they're all valued. So the first argument for this, in fact it was a key recommendation of Barclay, was that bringing all properties onto the roll improves transparency. And this should not be onerous. over 10,000 new entries have been made in the last 2 years, 3 years rather, well, it was just 2 years, in the wake of the Land Reform Act 2016, when shootings and...
Can I just clarify, are you speaking to Amendment 6?
Sorry, Convener, I've had... no, I'm not speaking to Amendment 6. Apologies. Sorry. Right. Can I start again?
Yes.
7 and 8 years.
I was, yeah. Sorry, right. Amendment 6 alters the basis of valuation of property. Currently, the whole property in the non-domestic race system is assessed to its rental value, which is a combination of the site and the improvements upon the site. This amendment provides that the valuation be split, as is done in Denmark, for example, so as to provide two values to the ratepayer. One values the unimproved site value, and the other provides the value of the improvements, typically buildings. And this will enable authorities, if of course they're given back the power to set the rate, to be in a position to weight the two valuations, so as to, for example, weight the rate more on the site value than improvements. This would avoid the current situation, which disincentivises improvements. And of course, a weighting of 100% on the site would in effect deliver land value taxation. A weighting the other way, of course, would be perfectly legitimate as well. So this is a reform to the way in which valuations are done and reported to ratepayers. It makes no change in and of itself to the way in which rates are set, or what rates are set. I believe this reform would provide greater flexibility in the way in which rates are applied and is easily implemented by copying the process that's already in place in countries like Denmark. Thanks, Convener. Apologies for setting off in the wrong group.
Not at all. Not at all. Any other members? Minister?
Thanks very much for that opening comments. In terms of the practical implications, and then moving on maybe to comment briefly on land value tax, that in terms of the practical implications, without sounding like a broken record, it's similar to my points in Amendment 1, is that it would be a fundamental change once again. And it's unclear to me what replacing the net annual value of properties, which in turn is used as the basis for their rateable value, with their value, in inverted commas, would achieve, short of leading to an immediate and fundamental change in the tax base and the way in which assessors ascribe a value to properties. My fear would be this would leave assessors in the very difficult position of having to determine, without the precedent of case law, what is an appropriate way to carry out valuations. In terms of land value tax, obviously the Barclay Review concluded that more work should be done to assess land values so that the debate over a land value tax could be better informed. But until that information exists, any move to a land value tax which has not been properly assessed, consulted on and scrutinised by the Parliament would constitute a complete and total overhaul of non-domestic rates. Finally, to the amendment itself, my fear would be that it would make parts of Section 6 of the Valuation and Rating Scotland Act 1956 unworkable, as well as a large number of other acts and secondary instruments which would have to be amended to refer to value rather than net annual value or rateable value. So in light of that, I'm unable to support that amendment.
Thank you. Andy?
Thanks very much. Yes, this would be, I wouldn't say a fundamental change. I mean, valuers undertake their valuation independently. It's not for us to tell valuers how to go about their business. They derive their own practice notes. They're members of International Association of Valuers. They're exposed on a routine basis to best practice globally. And this is not about implementing land value tax. There's nothing in this amendment that would require that. All this is about is providing a more nuanced valuation of sites. That, of course, would enable the implementation of land value tax, but it doesn't obligate it. I'll leave it there, Convener. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Press or withdraw?
Press.
Thank you. The question, therefore, is Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 6? 1. Those opposed? 6. Amendment 6 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 16. Is that right? Yeah, in the name of the Minister. Grouped with Amendment 17 and 18.
Thanks, Convener. So these amendments are relatively technical in nature. They relate to the mark that assessors have to include in entries in the valuation roll that relate to new builds and improved properties. That mark assists councils in determining eligibility for the Business Growth Accelerator relief. And these amendments exclude from the definition of, and I quote, newly built properties, those properties that are being added to the roll because they were previously exempt from being on it, but are not actually newly built. So examples would include agricultural lands and heritages and rural ATM sites. If those types of properties undergo a change in use, this may make them liable for entry in the roll, but the amendments ensure that only properties that are newly in existence will warrant a mark in the roll. Amendment 18 ensures that the assessor will remove the mark from an entry in the valuation roll when there is a change to the entry, for instance, at revaluation. And the purpose of that mark is to allow the local authority to identify which changes made by the assessor potentially qualify for Business Growth Accelerator relief. And once made, the purpose has been served, as the local authority will administer the relief for as long as the person is entitled to it. So there's no need for that mark to remain on the roll.
Does anybody have any comments? Thank you. Minister, would you wish to wind up?
I've got nothing further to say.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Amendment 16 is agreed to. I call Amendment 17 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 16. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. I call Amendment 18 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 16. Minister, to move forward.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Agreed. The question is that Section 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Section 3 is therefore agreed. I call Amendment 7 in the name of Andy Whiteman, grouped with Amendment 8. Andy Whiteman to move Amendment 7 and speak to both amendments in the group. Right. Again.
I apologise for that, Convener. Amendment 7, which I move. That's correct, isn't it? Right. As I was saying, recommendations 28 of Barclay was that all property should be on the valuation roll, with the exception of public infrastructure. And a key argument for this is that the current way in which we do exemptions in primary legislation means not only that there's no liability arising for exempt properties, but there's no information at all about the value associated with those properties and that costs are incurred by such exemptions on other ratepayers. And in previous remarks, I made an example of a £1 million a year agricultural operation being exempt. Yet it relies on all the local services that the schools, pubs, shops, and cafes do, which all are on the roll and all are valued. Whether pay rates or not, of course, is a separate question, given systems of relief, etc. So bringing all properties onto the roll would improve transparency. And as I said, it's not onerous. Over 10,000 have been entered in the 2 years following the 2016 Land Reform Act, when shootings and deer forests were brought back on to the roll, having been removed in 1994. Now, of course, if such properties that are currently...
Will you be willing to accept an intervention?
Yes.
Thanks very much for that. He said it's not onerous, but that's not really the evidence we got actually from the assessors themselves, who told us that they were already under severe pressure and difficulty actually recruiting new assessors. I'm just wondering if you can tell us what the cost of this exercise would be and what the purpose of it would be in financial terms, given that ministers have already made it clear they would provide 100% exemption for such buildings in any case.
Well, I haven't made an assessment of the costs, but the evidence I'm putting to you is the evidence of what's actually happened in the last 2 years, that over 10,000 properties have indeed been entered into the roll. Now, of course, if such properties are deemed worthy of having no liability to rates, that is better done by granting relief. Importantly, this then becomes a conscious decision that has to be justified and is open to scrutiny. So Amendment 7 brings all, I think there's one or two gaps perhaps, properties currently exempt, with the exception of some in subsection 3, onto the roll, which for various reasons cannot be on the...
Would the member take an attention?
Yep.
Yeah, just on that point. So what about... so that would therefore bring within the roll fish farms. Obviously, salmon companies pay rates on land, properties, processing plants and so forth. My understanding is that the offshore cages, etc., are leased from the Crown Estate. So that is the current arrangement. So what reflection have you made on the benefits or disadvantages of taking the position with regard to the Crown Estate and changing that without any consultation, it would appear, with any relevant stakeholders and potentially bringing that within the rates system. So there would be a double whammy, it would appear. Is that what you intend to do?
Well, I don't really understand the point of that intervention. Obviously, they're tenants of the Crown in the same way that
yes, but they
all
pay.
rate- all-
Can I pack back?
No, it was an intervention, not a debate.
No, I know, but he said he didn't
it's-
understand what
Andy
I said.
started answering it, so if he lets you intervene again, then I'll make it short. But if not, Andy, on you go.
Thanks, Convener. Obviously, they're tenants of the Crown, just like offices, tenants up on Tollcross are tenants of the Crown. They pay rates. That's what occupiers do. They pay rates. The fact that the landlord is the Crown is neither here nor there. The landlord could be, in fact, anybody. In fact, in some cases, it may not be
Would member take an intervention on that point?
the Crown. Well, okay.
After he's finished, if you want.
The member indicated he would take a very brief intervention. Well, therefore, in your scenario, these salmon farms offshore would pay leases to Crown Estate, which is the current arrangement, plus rates. Is that what you're advocating?
Well, yes, all tenants of non-domestic property pay, one presumes they pay rent to the landlord. That's a statement of the obvious. And they're liable for non-domestic rates. I don't understand what the issue here, just because you pay rent doesn't mean to say you don't pay rates. Anyway, moving on, I've dealt with Amendment 7. Amendment 8 is an alternative way of moving towards the same objective, although if one ever gets there, one may never get there. And I just want to explain that, of course, one of the problems with exemptions as such, as opposed to reliefs, is that they're set out in primary legislation, and therefore they can only be removed as exemptions by subsequent primary legislation, which, of course, is what Amendment 7 seeks to do. But I don't anticipate support for that. This is a sort of clumsy way of proceeding, I think, in many ways, to have things that are exempt in primary legislation that requires more primary legislation to amend that. If Amendment 7 is not agreed to, and I don't expect it to be, we lose the opportunity to review these exemptions until maybe another 20 years when we get another non-domestic rate bill. So what Amendment 8 does is allows exemptions that are currently set out in primary legislation, of which there are quite a lot, to be removed by secondary legislation. Now, of course, some exemptions are set out in primary and some exemptions are set out in secondary. Those ones that are set out in secondary, of course, can be easily removed or amended by secondary, but those that are set out in primary cannot be. They require a future primary legislation. So what Amendment 8 does is it gives the power of ministers to make regulations that would remove any exempt subjects that are currently exempt by means of primary legislation. It does not in of itself remove these exemptions, but it allows for that possibility over the coming years.
Take an intervention.
Well, I've just completed, but
That's great. If there's any members would like, and then can I just clarify, interventions are short and to the point. If you catch my eye, you'll be able to get in to make a contribution and make sure it's relevant. Graham, do you want to come in at this point? Yes,
Well, I was going to ask Mr. Whiteman a question, but I'll just make the point that it seems to me that Amendment 8 is better than Amendment 7 in that it would potentially tackle the serious issue raised by Ms Ewing. Amendment 8 would, it seems to me, allow ministers to at least consult on issues like this if it went through, whereas Amendment 7 I think is far too all-encompassing.
Yeah, I've got a similar point. I totally understand actually where Andy is coming from in these amendments, given that it was one of the recommendations from the Barclay Review. And I get the fact raised by Kenny Gibson that there is an issue of priorities. So there is an issue of timing here, but equally this is our chance to amend non-domestic rates. So I'm quite tempted by Amendment 8 as a way to do this, but it then would leave the Scottish Government with the capacity to do it at another point. It doesn't need to be done by Christmas, and you could get representations made, you could do consultation. So I think the principle is good. One issue I would want to raise is just to clarify the issue of ATMs, because we're seeing a removal of them right across the country, which means that people are losing access to cash machines. And there's also an issue about free cash machines. So I wouldn't want to do anything inadvertently to hasten their decline and removal. But my understanding of Amendment 8 is you would be able to craft what is exempted. And it doesn't automatically mean that things would go on to the paying rates, but it would enable them to be transparent in a way that they aren't. So for those reasons, I am keen to support Amendment 8. And the fact that we've got two choices isn't a bad thing for us. But I think 8 is better because it lets the government come back and do proper consultation. But we equally get progress, and it doesn't get parked for a decade or two. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Minister.
Amendment 7 first. I would agree that there's merit in having better information on the properties that Andy Whiteman identified, which are currently excluded from the valuation role. But I don't believe, in line with Barclay actually, that the administrative and associated financial burden on assessors and businesses would be worthwhile when we have no intention of levying rates on those subjects. So Barclay obviously proposed that in the interest of transparency, rather than exempting properties from the role, they should be entered in it, but with 100% relief. But that's not feasible for properties because of state aid constraints, particularly in agriculture and fisheries. So as such, removing the exemption would have significant cost implications for the agricultural sector and could easily see further deployment of offshore wind cease and present unnecessary risks to rural communities, for example, those that rely heavily on local bank cash machines. So I don't think that those inevitable consequences are a price worth paying for this amendment, particularly for the agricultural sector, which is obviously already facing huge uncertainties as a result of Brexit. So I would encourage the committee not to vote for Amendment 7. In terms of Amendment 8, there is no reason to resist or to reject Amendment 8. We don't see a need for the amendment because ministers already have the power to set exemptions by order. So I don't think that this amendment actually adds anything particularly new, but Andy Whiteman wants to intervene.
Yeah, just on that point, my understanding is that ministers cannot remove an existing exemption from primary legislation. And that's the point of 8. I mean, you appear to be arguing that you have already this power. That's not my understanding, but I stand to be corrected.
I mean, as I say, I'm fairly unequivocal, as it were, on the amendment. I don't see a need for it because exempted classes can already be set by order. But you're right in saying that we cannot exclude, which I think is your question to me. So on that point, if members wish to support Amendment 8, then we have, I mean, no concerns in that.
Thank you.
That's Amendment 8.
Thank you. Andy, to wind up.
Yes, that was helpful. And just to clarify on Amendment 8, ministers have the power, as I understand it, to make new exemptions under law, if they wish, by secondary legislation. What they don't have the power to do is to remove existing exemptions set out in primary. And this amendment is restricted to providing the power by regulation to remove existing exemptions in primary. That's all it does. As I understand it, powers exist already to create new exemptions. So I leave it there, Convener.
In that case, I call Amendment 7. And the name, sorry, the question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to.
No.
Okay. Sorry, I should have asked you if you were going to press or withdraw, but I take it you're pressing.
Yes.
Question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Right, okay. Those in favour of Amendment 7? 1. Those opposed? 6. I call Amendment 8. Sorry, so the Amendment 7 has fallen. Call Amendment 8 in the name of Andy Whiteman. Already debated with Amendment 7. Andy Whiteman to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Amendment 8 is therefore agreed to. Thank you. Call Amendment 19 in the name of the Minister. Grouped with Amendment 20. Minister to move Amendment 19 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. So these amendments address the committee's request in its Stage 1 report that the Scottish Government elucidates its policy more fully on Section 4 of the bill, with the aim of making the rules around the entering of parks in the valuation role more straightforward and easier to understand. Again, it's quite a technical one, which I will endeavour to explain. First, subsections, which is 1ZA and 1ZD of Section 19 of the Local Government Act 1963, seeks to ensure that where a part of a park is to be entered on the roll, a separate entry should be made for this part and the remainder should remain exempt. In other words, it's not our intention that the presence of a cafe in a public park should lead to the entry of the whole park in the roll. That's consistent with Barclay's recommendation that parks should remain exempt from being rateable. Secondly, subsections 1ZB and 1ZC set out under what conditions a park or a part of a park becomes rateable. The first reason, under 1ZB, is that the park is occupied by someone other than the council or other public body that controls the park. And the second reason, which is under 1ZC, is that the park, or part of the park, is occupied by the council or another public body that controls the park, and, critically, that payment may be required for access to facilities or for goods or services provided in it. So taken together, those two subsections will ensure that all commercial activity in parks will be rateable as recommended by Barclay. A key objective of the Barclay review was also to level the playing field, and subsections 1ZB and 1ZC will ensure equality of treatment between all activity, both commercial or charitable, and both inside and outside of parks. So all non-exempt properties, including those used for charitable purposes outside of parks, are currently rateable, and it's only fair that comparable properties inside of parks be rateable as well. So registered charities and community amateur sports clubs that fall to be entered on the roll as a result of Section 4 will be eligible for 80% mandatory relief and with a 20% discretionary top-up by the council, as is normal. And further, 100% discretionary relief is available for non-profit recreational activity. Certain properties that will be added to the roll as a result of Section 4 will likely be eligible for this relief, which I hope helps to explain what we're endeavouring to do with this significant redraft of Section 4.
Thank you. And does anybody else have any comment? No. In that case, Minister, would you like to press the amendment?
Press.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? 19 is agreed to. I call Amendment 20 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 19. Minister to move formally.
Press.
The question is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 20 is agreed to. The question is that Section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Section 4 is therefore agreed to. I call Amendment 85 in the name of Sarah Boyack in a group in its own. Sarah Boyack to move and speak to Amendment 85.
Thank you very much, Convener. This is an issue that's a really big issue locally that I wanted to bring to the debate on non-domestic rates. We've seen a significant expansion of private student residences over the last few years. And historically, universities and colleges provided their own in-house accommodation, but there's been a big shift to private providers, and the accommodation is very expensive. Students often have no choice because of the shortage of housing in the city. And access to accommodation is particularly challenging for students from overseas who don't know the area till they get settled on their course. And students are rightly exempted from council tax. That should be defended, and I have no intention to change that. But I do want to question about companies making a profit from renting out accommodation that should be expected to make a contribution to our councils for the local services that are provided. In addition, they should make that contribution without passing it on to the students they rent to. But there's a particular issue I wanted to raise, which is the use of private student accommodation that's let out in the summer for tourism use. Again, the companies renting out these properties are making a profit, but aren't making a contribution to the provision of local services. Now, my amendment as crafted would leave the details of how this would be implemented to the Scottish Government, and I believe we need consultation on the details. But I do think it's something that we should be debating as we discuss the extent to which non-domestic rates are levied and who should be required to pay. So I'd be very interested to see the thoughts from colleagues on this amendment, and I move the amendment in my name, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody have any comment to make on it? Graham?
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I think Sarah Boyack raises a really interesting issue, because you do have a number of these developments cropping up, certainly in Edinburgh and I think Glasgow and other cities, privately run. Not that matters, but for most of the year, rented out to students, and when the students aren't there, they are let out, well, essentially to tourists. So they become bona fide businesses competing with other businesses in the self-catering sector. So the idea that they shouldn't pay non-domestic rates for that part of the year when they are businesses seems wrong. There could be unintended consequences in that these businesses could then hit the students for increased bills. That's a danger. But I think at this point, this is one of these amendments that I think is worth supporting at this stage, and it possibly needs a bit further work. So I'd be prepared to support it at this point, and we'll see where we go from there.
Okay, thank you very much. Minister.
Thanks, Convener. I welcome Sarah Boyack's explanation of her policy intent, and I'm certainly sympathetic to what she's trying to do. But I'm going through a few of my own thoughts. The Barclay Review obviously recommended that charity relief be reformed anyway as regards student accommodation, although it didn't distinguish between accommodation let by the institutions themselves and those provided by the private sector. At the time, we rejected that recommendation in part due to the practicability of distinguishing commercial from non-commercial use. And the amendment doesn't seek to distinguish between commercial and non-commercial use, but instead seeks to make private sector and other landlords liable to be rated whilst providing an exemption for the institutional providers. My concern is around the analysis of what the unintended consequences might be, particularly for students, because my concern would be the potential impact on students who may see their accommodation choices reduce or become less affordable, as it would, as landlords may have little option but to pass on the costs in terms of higher rents to students. And therefore, I would be unable to support it without having done a little bit more analysis and perhaps some consultation on what the consequences would be. But I'd be very happy to have a conversation in advance of stage 3 and to see if further analysis could be done in advance of stage 3 on this particular amendment. But at present, the potential for unintended consequences are too little analysed for me to be able to support.
Thank you very much. Sarah, wind up.
Yeah, I appreciate the Minister's comments and very much welcome them. I think they're, and as colleagues have both said, Graham Simpson and the Minister, I would be the last person that would want to deliver unintended consequences. But I think because it was actually raised earlier, it is in the mission not to be discussed. And I think the issue I would be interested in terms of stage 3 would be amending it, potentially crafting it, looking at the summer issue in particular. And I'd be happy to come back to have a look at that through the process of the next few months. And I think it is one of those issues about what would be the process in terms of government bringing forward potential regulations and the detail of this afterwards. Because as I understand it, there are issues in relation to how it relates to the HMO system. So there is actually money paid through the HMO system. But I do want to distinguish between the private and the university or college-owned sector, and I think this is something that is worthy of merit for us for taking on further into stage 3. Thank you, Convener.
So can I ask if you're going to press or withdraw?
I'd like to press at this stage.
Okay. In that case, the question is that Amendment 85 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay. Therefore, Amendment 85 is agreed to. The question is that Section 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Okay. I call Amendment 21 in the name of the Minister. grouped with amendments as shown on the groupings. Minister to move Amendment 21 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. So these amendments all relate to reforming the appeal system. And if I may, I'll first speak to the amendments I've lodged and then turn to the amendment in Mr Stewart's name. These amendments have been informed by the final report of the Barclay Implementation Advisory Appeals Subgroup, which was published on the 10th of October. So Amendment 21, and again, it's quite technical, requires that the assessor at revaluation for a given property enter in the evaluation role information, including the valuation that has been agreed in writing between them and the proprietor, the tenant or the occupier beforehand, whether or not the agreement was reached before or after publication of the draft role. The only exception is if, since the agreement was reached, there has been a material change in circumstances. So that's Amendment 21. Amendment 22 introduces a requirement on assessors to publish a draft valuation role before they make up the final role. It's intended that a date for publication of the draft role will be specified by Scottish ministers, and it also requires that assessors send to the proprietor, tenant and occupier of the property a draft valuation notice containing the details listed in the draft role. The amendment also allows ministers to specify by negative procedure regulations any other information to be included in the notice. So a person who receives a draft valuation notice can make representations to the assessor about the content of that notice. However, the assessor is not bound by the contents of the draft role or draft notice when making up the final role, as there may be a need to amend the draft role before it comes into force. For example, if new information has become available which would affect the valuation. This then links with the other amendments I'm proposing to allow the proprietor, the tenant or the occupier to make representations once the draft role is published about what the entry in the role should be. Amendment 24 seeks to ensure that a person may not lodge a proposal to alter an entry in the valuation role following revaluation if there has been a prior agreement in writing between that person and the assessor. That's based on a recommendation from the appeals subgroup that pre-agreements should be binding on a person in this situation, so that a proposal cannot be lodged by a person against a pre-agreed value. Amendments 25, 26 and 27 allow the assessor to adjust the valuation role entry for a property where a proposal has been lodged, either in accordance with the proposal or in the manner that the assessor sees fit. That does not require the agreement of the proposer, as the assessor's role is to provide an accurate valuation with the information available at the time the entry is finalised, and there may be information which suggests the alternative value requested in the proposal is incorrect. If the person's proposal is not accepted, Amendment 32 provides that the person can appeal. Amendment 28 allows Scottish ministers by regulations to set fees in relation to lodging proposals as recommended by this committee in its Stage 1 report. So that is in direct response to the committee's report. And Amendment 29 provides that those regulations will follow the affirmative procedure. Amendments 30, 32 and 33 will ensure that where a person has lodged a proposal, only that person may appeal to the Valuation Appeal Committee. That is, for example, to prevent the assessor discussing and agreeing a proposal with a tenant and then the owner seeking to appeal. If the owner wishes to be involved, they would have to get involved at the proposal stage. Amendments 34 and 35 aim to ensure that an appeal can only be made on the same basis as the proposal. That is to prevent an appeal being made on a completely new basis that the assessor has not considered. And Amendment 37 will mean that complaints to the Valuation Appeal Committee under the Land Valuation Act 1854 can only be lodged by a person who is not the proprietor, the tenant or the occupier of the property. As members will know, complaints are a separate way from appeals to have an entry in the role reviewed or to raise the absence of an entry. The ability of third parties to continue to raise complaints is unaffected by this amendment. The amendment is to avoid the risk that proprietors, tenants and occupiers may attempt to circumvent the new proposal stage being introduced and any fees that are attached to it by complaining to the Valuation Appeal Committee about their own property's value rather than going through the normal route of proposing or lodging a proposal. Yeah.
So these are some. I'm listening carefully to what you're saying. Can I just take you back to, I think it was 32 and 33, where you're saying that an occupier, a tenant who lodges a proposal, the proprietor cannot do so. But in those circumstances, how would the proprietor know that the tenant had lodged a proposal? I mean, is there, at the moment, they can appeal.
Yeah.
So if you're removing this right of appeal,
So an owner can get involved at the proposal stage, and that would be down to them. They will have they will know that an evaluation is due. So with moving to a new system, the new system, of course, is that two-stage system where you propose and then you can appeal, which incidentally formalises what already takes place in an informal basis. So the hope is that that system actually is not necessarily creating anything new, it's formalising current system. So in terms of where an owner currently is not choosing to get involved, then I can see there may be challenges going forward. But I would hope that an owner would be interested in the business rates that they're liable for, or their property is liable for, and the valuation of that property. So really it's a question of whether or not the owner chooses to get involved with the process at all. This is merely trying to avoid adding additional time delays and bureaucracy, that where an assessor has agreed a proposal with the person, a tenant or an owner, the owner cannot then come down later down the line and say, actually, I fundamentally disagree with that proposal, and trying to appeal in that way. So the parties that are involved in the proposal are the same parties that have to be involved in the appeal. You cannot introduce a new individual. If we don't do that, then it of course completely undermines that proposal stage, because you could always be sure of overturning the proposal at an appeal stage. Does that help?
I think we'll leave it there.
Okay. Yeah.
Make one more.
Yeah.
I suppose my point was, if the proprietor opportunities are being restricted as they are, is there not an argument that they have to be made aware that there is a proposal being made? Because if they're not aware of that, then they lose the one opportunity they might have to have some discussions. I'll leave you to take away that question. It may not actually be relevant. It's just a
Thanks.
concern.
I will take that away, and that is something that we could consider in terms of how we notify owners that a proposal has been lodged. I think it's a fair comment. So I think that brought me on to Mr. Stewart's amendment, 36, which places a requirement on Scottish ministers to consult with local authorities, assessors, business sector representatives and such other persons as they consider appropriate before making regulations to set fees in connection with appeals. We've taken a consultative approach throughout the bill process and will continue to do so. So essentially, if Mr. Stewart wants to press his amendment, then I would be happy to support it. If, however, he wishes to bring it back at stage 3, I'd be very keen to work with him to adjust it slightly in certain elements. So currently, I expect that government would consult representatives of assessors and representatives of the business sector. I'm not convinced that that needs to be done on an individual basis regarding assessors and local authorities. But like I say, if Mr. Stewart presses, we'll support. If there's anything we can do to fine-tune it for stage 3, then I'd be keen to work with him on that.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I'll bring in Alexander Stewart to speak to Amendment 36.
Thank you, Convener. And can I thank the Minister for the positive comments with relation to this amendment. I wish to press, and the reasons behind the Minister has outlined that it will ensure that there is an opportunity of first gathering evidence on the impact of the policy change for individuals and organisations. And I think that's important. And at this stage, I am more than happy for this to go forward. And I'm more than happy also to have some discussion with the Minister as we progress this into stage 3. And if there are areas that we can fine-tune, then I think that would be advantageous to the bill, but also very advantageous to the sector, because that's what they're trying to achieve and ensure that that takes place. Because it's all about ensuring that we have that constructive cooperation and that constructive consultation that takes place to ensure that we're providing the best for the organisations, individuals and the business sector. So thank you. I'm happy to press.
Much. Andrew, you wanted to come on?
Yes, I just wanted to make a brief comment about Amendment 36, which is, I agree with the Minister's comments and indeed Mr Stewart's comments. But it says amongst those to be consulted are C, representatives of the business sector. I'd just like to remind members that these are not business rates, these are non-domestic rates. I mean, I'm a board member of a statutory corporation that owns this property that pays 7 million rates. That really should be representatives of ratepayers, if you like, because occupiers who are businesses, I think, are only less than 2/3 of all ratepayers.
I'm sure that's something that they can clarify for the amendment for stage 3. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Minister, would you like to wind up?
No, just I appreciate Alexander Stewart's commitment to work with me to adjust it slightly.
And press.
And pressed.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Amendment 21 is agreed to. Call Amendment 22 in the name of the Minister. Already debated with Amendment 21. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Amendment 22 is agreed to. The question is that Section 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Therefore, question 6 is agreed to. Thank you. I call Amendment 23 in the name of the Minister. Groups Amendments 31 and 52. Minister, to move Amendment 23 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. These 3 amendments are once again very technical in nature, and it might be helpful, although members may know already, if I explain that some subjects are valued by what are called designated assessors. And there are 5 such assessors in Scotland who, in addition to their day job as an assessor, also have responsibility for valuing certain subjects which could broadly be described as the former public utilities. So, for example, the Fife assessor is currently the designated assessor for water subjects in Scotland, and once a valuation has been determined for all water subjects in Scotland, then this information is entered on the Fife assessor's valuation roll. So in short, the designated assessor regime is, unlike the assessor regime, a subject-based approach rather than a geography-based approach. The amendments before the committee today refine the drafting to provide that, and I follow with a list. Firstly, a new proprietor, tenant or occupier can make a proposal to the assessor or the designated assessor as appropriate that appeals against a valuation determined by either an assessor or a designated assessor can be lodged with a valuation appeal committee, and it will always be a committee for the area where the lands and the heritages are entered in the valuation roll. That an assessor information notice can be issued as appropriate by an assessor or a designated assessor. And that is, in short, what these amendments relate to. And I move Amendment 23.
Thank you very much. Any other members? Not in that case. You've moved. You've pressed it. The question is that Amendment 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. I call Amendments 24, 25, 26, 27 and 28, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. I invite Minister to move Amendments 24 to 28 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 24 to 28? In that case, I will take them one at a time, and I call Amendment 24. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Sorry? Sorry. Yeah. Right, okay. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. 25?
Moved.
And the question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. And answer 26?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Okay, it's agreed to. 27?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay, in that case, those in favour of Amendment 27? Thank you. Right, okay. Can we put your Etch-a-Sketch away, please? That's five agree. Those opposed? 2. Amendment 27 is agreed to. And 28?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. Amendment 28 is agreed to. I call amendments 86 in the name of Sarah Boyack, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Sarah Boyack to move amendment 86 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thanks very much, Convener. One of the issues that was picked up by the DPLR committee was about the powers of ministers and whether they had too much power at the moment. And these amendments are proposed to limit the powers of ministers by removing their ability to make extra regulations, and they're my attempt with support from the drafters to try and deliver that. So specifically they attempt to seek to limit the extent of the powers that can be exercised by the Scottish ministers. Now I'm also conscious that the Scottish Government has now raised its series of amendments. Without predicting too much, I'm going to guess that they are going to say that theirs are better crafted. So I suppose what I'd be keen to see is a discussion about the differences between the two. But the way that my amendments are crafted are to remove the power to make provision for, inverted commas, such other matters which appear in sections 7, 18, 19, 20 and 21. And putting these together, I think they provide an appropriate constraint on ministers' powers. So it's really it's relatively straightforward, and I'll maybe not say any more than that at this point. I move the First Amendment in my name, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Minister, speak to Amendment 65 and other amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener. So thanks also to Sarah Boyack for speaking to her amendments and outlining her reasons for wishing to restrict the use of ancillary powers. And I think we're all agreed, and as Sarah Boyack said, we have submitted our own amendments to respond to the legitimate concerns that were raised by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, and I thank them for their very thorough scrutiny of the delegated powers contained in the bill. I think we're all agreed that this bill proposes amendments to a very complex rating system, and that creates a risk that a change to one part of the system may have unintended consequences on another part of the system, and the bill introduces considerable new elements into the rating system as well, an example being the introduction of a civil penalty regime. And so ancillary provision may be needed as those new elements are created or as experience is gained and those elements are further developed. So we considered that it was prudent to have some flexibility in how the ancillary powers within the bill are used, whilst being mindful of the narrow context within which each of the ancillary powers must operate within. And such flexibility enables unforeseen matters to be dealt with without the need to return with primary legislation due to the powers being rigid. So, of course, all uses of powers are quite properly subject to Parliament oversight, which allows Parliament the opportunity to stop any use it felt was inappropriate. Amendments 86 and 87 relate to Section 7A of the bill, which inserts new provisions. The Scottish Government's view is that it's clearer to the reader to have the full powers set out in the 1975 Act, which currently lacks them. And that was a point that was acknowledged by the DPLR committee. So if Sarah Boyack's amendments are accepted, that would lead the reader seeing a power in the 1975 Act and noting that it lacks the usual incidental powers. The reader may easily miss that there are incidental powers available for use from the Act that introduced the power. In relation to Amendments 97, 98, 99 and 100, the Scottish Government considers the innovative nature of the civil penalty regime, making it extremely difficult to anticipate what types of provision might be required to be made as the regime beds in. But arguably, it's not within the power to make further provision about civil penalty notices and appeals against the penalties set. So the Scottish Government's response to the DPLR Committee Stage 1 report said that we would bring forward amendments, and amendments 65, 68, 71 and 72 relate to that. Those amendments, I believe, but it's subject to members' opinions, that they strike an appropriate balance between having flexibility in how powers can be used to respond to a very new and complex process, but at the same time maintaining limits that are tied to the purposes of the Act itself. And the amendments have regard to the views of the DPLR Committee on where that balance should be struck. So I think, in conclusion, that whilst our amendments are endeavouring to do the same thing, we go about it in slightly different ways.
Okay, thank you. Andy?
So, not having closely studied the DPLR report, it's not clear to me where exactly they recommended that there be modifications. And I just wonder if Sarah Boyack, in winding up, could clarify whether, in fact, her amendments respond directly to DPLR recommendations, or are they additional?
Sarah? Sarah Boyack, to wind up.
Well, they were intended to respond to the DPLR Committee. That was the intention of putting them together, yes.
Okay.
It's your view as to whether we do that effectively enough or not.
Certainly not Andy, she's not read it since. Sarah, would you like to wind up and press or withdraw?
Yeah, I suppose that... Does somebody else want to come in?
Yeah, Minister, do you want to go back in?
No, I mean, unless Mr Whiteman wants the exact quote from the DPLR Committee's comments, but I think that may absorb time. But
okay, that's fine.
Nope. That's fine. And as somebody who wasn't on the first stage of this committee, when you went through the initial report, it's quite hard coming into those issues. But I think the key issue here is about scrutiny, transparency, and getting the right balance between giving ministers full powers and making sure that they don't have additional powers that are beyond what's actually needed. So I think here I suppose the one issue I would seek a comment from the Minister is the extent to which our amendments do the same thing or which they overlap from each other. I don't know if you want to intervene at this point, Minister.
I can to an extent. I mean, they are... I do firmly believe that they are seeking to achieve the same thing, but they are doing it in different ways. They have, been drafted differently. So it's obviously very complicated, but the DPLR Committee was essentially concerned about duplication between pairs of provisions. In some cases, Sarah Boyack's amendments have removed or have added in additional information to remove that duplication. In other cases, we have just removed sections to achieve the same thing, if that makes sense. So there's no bones about it. We have gone about it in slightly different ways. But I think, and I know that DPLR Committee considered the amendments at their committee session, and my hope would be that they had no concerns with the amendments that I was proposing and that the amendments achieve that ambition. But it is true to say that in the way that they're drafted, the amendments are slightly different because to deal with that duplication between pairs of provisions, in some cases you've added things and in some cases I've removed things.
It's very helpful, Minister. I know that, Graham, you were on that committee, but you're not attempting to intervene at this point. I think I'd be happy to take an intervention given that you're on that committee in terms of your views.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the committee on this committee, but my view would be that the committee would be happy with the government's approach. You do appear to be trying to do the same thing in different ways, as the Minister said. What I would suggest to you is that you maybe don't move yours. The DPLR committee will look at the bill again after this stage, and if it still has concerns, it would report back. So you'll be able to see that, and there'll be the Minister would get a copy of the committee's report.
That's very helpful. I am conscious that the Minister's amendments went to the committee and mine haven't. So with that in mind, at this stage, Convener, if it's acceptable, I will not press my first amendment, which I have already moved.
Thank you.
It lets me come back at stage 3 if I wish to, but I think at this stage I'd be happy to support the Minister's amendments and not move all mine.
So you're withdrawing? Right,
Yep.
Okay. Sarah Boyack wishes to withdraw her amendment. Does any member present have any objection to the amendment being withdrawn? Okay, in that case, the amendment 86 is withdrawn. Thank you. And I call amendments 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34 and 35, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated, and invite the Minister to move amendments 29 to 35 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
I ask whether any member objects to a single question being put on amendments 29 to 35. Thank you. The question is that amendments 29 to 35 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. They are agreed to. I call amendment 36 in the name of Alexander Stewart, already debated with amendment 21. Alexander Stewart, to move or not move?
Move.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 36 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Amendment 36 is therefore agreed to. I call amendment 87 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with amendment 86. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. The question is that section 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The section 7 is agreed to. The question is that section 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. The question is, the section 8 is therefore agreed to. I call amendment 37 in the name of the Minister, already debated with amendment 21. Minister, to move forward.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 37 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? All agreed. Thank you. I call amendment 38 in the name of the Minister and a group on its own. Minister, to move and speak to the amendment.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 38 excludes a change in rent, in valuations generally or in values generally, from the definition of, and I quote, material changes in circumstances, which is in the Local Government Scotland Act 1975. That restricts the circumstances in which general economic factors can be regarded as relevant to a change in valuation and reverts back to the situation which existed prior to 1984. This recommendation was set out by the Scottish Assessors Association in a letter to the committee dated the 25th of October on the basis that a move to 3 yearly revaluations, coupled with Barclay's recommendation to move to a 1 year tone date in future, would ensure that valuations are in future much more closely aligned to current market values. The association concluded that it no longer saw the need for appeals based upon a material change of circumstances related to economic changes. A number of written submissions to the committee's call for evidence on the bill also called for the definition of material changes in circumstances to be reviewed to improve consistency of interpretation. Scotland was unique in the UK in having opened the door to changes in rental values being considered a material change of circumstances by explicitly allowing such changes to be considered in the Rating and Valuation Amendment Scotland Act 1984. With a significantly reduced period between revaluations that the bill introduces, the need for reviews of rateable values on this basis is also removed. Appeals are often resource intensive for all parties involved, and I believe the time has come to undo that change that was made in 1984.
Thank you. Any other members? Okay. Minister, press? Thank you. The question is that amendment 38 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Right, we're all agreed. I think at this time we'll take a short suspend for a short time. Just have a break. I call Amendment 9 in the name of Andy Whiteman, grouped with Amendments 10, 11 and 12. Andy Whiteman to move Amendment 9 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener. I move Amendment 9. Amendment 9 is a very significant amendment. As members know, non-domestic rates are a local tax. For well over a century, they were under the full control of the level of government to whom they belonged. That's to say the county, the region, the district, and now the unitary authority. In the 1990s, the UK government took away the power from local government and centralised the rate-setting power with the Secretary of State for Scotland, from whom, by virtue of devolution, Scottish ministers have inherited that power. And so the rate, as members know, is set by a negative instrument that comes before this committee. I believe this is fundamentally wrong. This is a local tax. It belongs to local government, it belongs to councils, and they should be given back the powers that were removed from them 25 years ago. I consulted on this and indeed other measures over summer 2019 and received a range of views. Local authorities, COSLA in particular, have long argued for the repatriation of rates, but there were two issues that arose in responses from COSLA, local authorities and others, and I've sought to deal with them both in this amendment. First of all, such a change will take time. I never envisaged it would happen overnight. There are consequential issues to sort out that needn't detain us today. But I've framed the amendment in such a way that this change can take place as late as 2024, has to be achieved by 2024. And that gives 4 or 5 years to implement this. I'm open-minded about whether that date might be changed, but the significant point is that time is being put in place to deal with this. And I just refer to my earlier comment as well about the fact that this is the first time in the history of devolution for 20 years that we have primary legislation on non-domestic rates, which is the second largest tax revenue of the Scottish Parliament. We may not have another 20 years. So if there is a desire, which I do actually believe there is a desire amongst all parties, if not by all parties, to increase the fiscal autonomy of local government and return to them that which is theirs in the first place, then this is the opportunity, this legislative process, perhaps not today, I don't know, but certainly this legislative process to do something about that. The second point that some councils made to me was that they don't want to set their own rate. That's fine. And so subsection 3 allows any council who doesn't want this power to ask Scottish ministers to do so on their behalf. So that's Amendment 9, which, as I say, is a fundamental amendment. It returns us to where we were prior to 1994. Amendment 10 is much the same, but it introduces a kind of halfway house in the sense that there still would be national rates, but there'd also be a regional rate, so that councils would set a rate, but also ministers would set a rate subject to the approval of Parliament. So that's the only real difference between the two. This is what happens in Northern Ireland, for example, where councils set part of the rate and the Northern Ireland executive set the other. So that's Amendment 9 and 10. 11 and 12 are entirely different, and again, one makes provision in the circumstances that there's a regional rate, which is 11, and Amendment 12 is about the situation as it is at the moment. And what 11 and 12 are about is the fact that at the moment the Community Empowerment Act was introduced amendments to the 62 Act that allows councils to introduce new reliefs, non-domestic rate reliefs. Crucially, however, this has to be paid for by the council themselves. And I think it was a visit this committee took made to Kilmarnock, where we were in discussion with local ratepayers, councillors, council officials, where they were expressing a desire for more autonomy in the detail of how rates applied in their town, to, for example, give some reliefs for very specific circumstances, for very specific subjects in very specific areas, and perhaps to raise a bit more from other subjects in very specific areas, because they found the powers that they have far, far too blunt to be able to incentivise the kind of changes, the kind of reforms, the kind of activities they'd like to see taking place in the town. So what Amendment 11 and 12 do is it allows councils to raise the rates in a similar way to how they can provide reliefs, but only up to the amount being relieved. So, for example, if a council wishes a relief scheme that's worth, for the sake of argument, £500,000, that's to say that ratepayers would be relieved of the liability to pay £500,000. They could also at the same time introduce a scheme to vary the rates, to increase the rates on other subjects up to that same limit. So this would be a net cost neutral in terms of council revenues. And the only difference between the two, of course, is Amendment 11 responds to the eventuality that there is a regional rate envisaged by Amendment 10, and Amendment 12 envisages this as it applies to the non-domestic rating system as it exists at the moment. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Graham?
Thanks, Convener. If I can talk about Amendments 9 and 10, which are slightly different. So if we take Amendment 9 first, I think Andy Whiteman here is trying to empower local authorities to enable them to set their own rates, and he used the word incentivisation. And I think if councils were to be given this power, that gives them the opportunity to set rates which can incentivise companies to come into their areas. Of course, they could do entirely the opposite. I think this is possibly what some businesses are concerned about. They could set colossal rates, and that would drive businesses away. But that is up to councils to make those decisions. So I'm quite attracted to this amendment. We as a party have always been a localist party, so a number of our councillors are quite keen on this idea.
Will you take an intervention?
I certainly will.
Was it not the Conservatives that actually brought in rates being pooled on all Scotland level? So I'm not really sure about the phrase "we've always been a localist party." In actual fact, it was your own party that changed the previous regime.
Thank you to Mr Gibson for that. So certainly in my time, we've been a localist party, and when I was the local government spokesman, I drew up a manifesto which for the local government elections, which covered exactly this kind of point. But I'll take Mr Gibson's history lesson on board. As regards Amendment 10, however, there's been a lot of concern raised in the business community about this. The idea of having a national and a regional rate is pretty scary to businesses, and committee members will have had a number of submissions on this, and I think that goes too far. So it would be, I think at this point, supportive of 9. Not supportive of 10 or the others.
Okay, thank you. Annabelle.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I mean, my recollection from committee is that actually COSLA were not seeking this at this point. Their point in this regard was that they didn't want this discussion to sit outside the wider discussion on a local government fiscal framework. They wanted this discussion to sit within the parameters of the wider discussion. Therefore, they said indeed that they believe that non-domestic rates should be considered as part of that. It should not sit outside it. So I'm a wee bit confused as to, given that was COSLA's clear position in evidence before us, why Mr Whiteman feels that, notwithstanding COSLA's position, he has some other objective in mind at this stage.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, I think these amendments are timely, but like many of the amendments in this bill, they're actually quite difficult because they've been added in at stage 2, which before Andy Whiteman jumps up and down is not a criticism. I think these are actually all valid discussions to be having. I think the challenge for me is I'd be very interested in seeing the comments that different parties who's commented on your consultation gave in, Andy, because I think it would be interesting to see the nuances, because not having had much time to consult my own colleagues about this, I've got different views from different people. I think one of the there's clearly an issue about pooling of non-domestic rates and giving local authorities much more freedom, and I can see a debate on this across the parties. For me, looking at can you talk a bit more in Amendment 9 when you close about the significance of the date of 2024 You've talked about 5 years to implement regulations. What scope is there for having a proper discussion and consultation on this? Because I think the point that was made by Annabel a minute ago about the wider issue about local government is actually right, that we do need a consultation that joins up the dots. The problem is that this bill doesn't give us that, and we don't have other opportunities to do that. So as the Local Government and Communities Committee, we are in pole position to do this, but the bill doesn't necessarily let us do all of this. So I was wondering, to what extent do we have the opportunity to have a discussion on this before stage 3 as a committee, potentially to get evidence on it? Amendment 9, less keen at for other reasons in terms of you'd have a national rate and then potentially an additional rate on top of that.
Amendment 10.
Yes, sorry, did I say amendment? Right, I meant amendment 10, the top of my second page here, amendment 10. So that distinction, I'd like you to talk a bit about that. Is this, to what extent is this seen as an opportunity to raise more money by local government? Because as I understand it, in Northern Ireland, it's led to a 20% increase in rates being collected. Amendments 10 and 11, I'm very persuaded by, and I'm going to support. I like the idea that where local governments have got, just to understand, I understand this correctly, they have the rates have been collected, they've got their pooled rates back, and then they're able to make adjustments. So if they're doing something like a town centre improvement regeneration project, they can lower rates in one area as long as they collect it in elsewhere. So I think it gives them more flexibility, and lets them target, and hopefully lets them bring about more regeneration, if that's one of their priorities. So there's quite a few questions in there, but it's partly, I think, the nature, the scale of these amendments, which are pretty big in terms of their impact. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I think, Convener, a lot of really good points from everyone, who's spoken so far, including obviously Andy himself. I have concerns because I represent an area where unless we have very strong reorganisation of how the local government funding formula is addressed, then this could be extremely harmful for areas like mine, because many people in North Ayrshire and indeed North Lanarkshire and places like that actually shop in places like Glasgow, and there would be a huge increase, all else being equal, in the rates gathered in the cities, and a huge fall actually in other local authority areas unless the entire redistribution model was looked at. And I think that's a major concern. I think that's why Annabelle's point is so valid, because I really need to look at it around. We'd have to have a starting point whereby if rates poundage went down by several million one area, the formula was adjusted and we could then perhaps move forward. But I really think that is such a fundamental realignment of local government finance that having it in an amendment into a bill on non-domestic rates is just inappropriate. I mean, it really, it's been discussed for a number of years and it will be continue to be discussed, but until we can actually sit down and look at this whole thing in the round, I really don't think it's we should be supporting it at this point.
Thank you. Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. Like others, I've got some merit with Amendment 9, because I do think that it does bring and attempts to bring localism back into the mix, and I am once again quite supportive of that. With reference to Amendment 10, I think there is a step too far. The model would be disadvantage individuals and organisations, and we can see that from some of the submissions we've had, the anxiety and the fear into this, and it could have a major detrimental effect on the business community within some sectors and within some locations. So I would certainly not be in favour of 10. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Minister.
Thanks, Convener. So I have quite serious concerns with these amendments. My principal concerns relate to the policy, but I think it's important to highlight that I'm also concerned with Amendments 9 and 10 as drafted, because they're technically problematic in that they refer to and rely on amendments to Section 7 of the 1975 Act that have not been lodged, and Amendments 11 and 12 are predicated on Amendment 10 passing. So those challenges are passed on. So in the way that they're drafted right now, it's simply not apparent what would be required of local authorities, and the legislative implications remain unclear. In that sense, they present a serious risk to the operation of the non-domestic rates system. However, my primary concerns go well beyond their technical challenges. I respect Andy Whiteman's view that powers over non-domestic rates should be returned to local authorities, but I think it's important to recognise that, as Annabel Ewing said, that neither local authorities nor ratepayers currently support such a change, and there's been no substantive consultation or scrutiny of those proposals. Barclay Review itself ruled out such a change, highlighting that ratepayers value consistency and that consistency would be lost. And COSLA have been explicit, again, as Annabel mentioned, including in evidence to this committee, that discussions on the devolution of non-domestic rates should not be considered outside the discussions to develop a fiscal framework for local government. It's also worth noting that organisations like the Scottish Retail Consortium consider this, and I quote, a retrograde step and is anomalous with the thrust of the reform agenda of enhanced predictability and competitiveness. I think the nature of the economy, and indeed local economies, have moved on quite considerably since 1975, not that I remember it as a year, and as such, simply reinstating local rates setting power without giving significant thought as to how that might have an impact upon individual local authority finances would not be wise. It's not clear how much flexibility individual councils would have in reality from these amendments. Some will have scope to adjust rates to suit local circumstances, but others will effectively be obliged to match or to undercut rates set by neighbouring, potentially larger councils and accept the significant revenue risks therein. So I don't believe that a change of this magnitude should be taken forward without genuine consultation. I will.
Given that we do have periodic reviews of local government finance, since joining the committee, I've started reading through almost every government has a review, and then it gets parked. And there's a plea for having a joined-up approach to both council tax and non-domestic rates. What are your proposals to actually come back to this? Because the Barclay Review itself was so tightly constrained, and then you've been arguing that we shouldn't add anything else to this bill. But when is the golden opportunity to actually come back and discuss these issues?
It's a fair question. I don't think it's now in terms of adding an amendment. And as you say, Barclay had a very specific purpose, and therefore adding it is without that proper scrutiny and consultation. In terms of local governance review, that has got to be done in partnership with COSLA. COSLA have got to be part of that conversation in terms of what local government finances look like in the round. That includes council tax, it includes non-domestic rates, and it includes grant mechanisms. That review is ongoing right now with COSLA involved, and it's for COSLA, I think, as a partner of that review to inform what local government finances look like. I think by putting an amendment into this bill, that undercuts that process, and I also think that a change of this magnitude should be subject to analysis and scrutiny. So in that vein, I would not support those amendments.
Thank you. Andy, would you like to weigh?
Thanks very much. Yes, just a few points in response to members. I mean, it's been a long-standing position of COSLA that they do want the repatriation of non-domestic rates. In evidence to this committee, I can't remember the person who gave it, Annabel Ewing's correct, they don't see that happening just now, and I'm not envisaging it happening just now either. And it should take place in the context of the development of a fiscal framework, which, as I understand, the government is committed to designing and implementing in coordination with COSLA. And of course it would take place within the context of appropriate adjustments, and I'll come back to Kenny Gibson's point on this, to the settlement formula. So what Amendment 9 is doing is it's placing the commitment to do this in the bill. And as I said, I'm very relaxed about by when this should be done. If I think 2030 is better than 2024, fine, we can have that discussion. But if we don't make provision for it, then COSLA's desire for it not to happen now, of course, will take place, but COSLA's longer-term desire and long-standing position that these are local taxes and they should set their local taxes. I mean, if the UK government were to say that it was going to set devolved taxes to this Parliament, I think most parties would be quite aggrieved about that. This is a local tax, it should be set by local councils. What this amendment is seeking to do is to make that provision, but to delay its implementation, to give plenty time to deal with all of this. And that relates to Sarah Boyack's point. So by 2024, it could be 26 or 28 or 25. I want to give sufficient time for there to be further discussions with COSLA about the knock-on implications of this, which are not particularly profound. I mean, Kenny Gibson talked about the funding formula change. Well, I mean, at the moment, councils keep the rates that they raised. There's a complicated system where they provide the net difference between the predicted amount to the Scottish Government and they redistribute it as part of the settlement. So the fact is that councils that are currently in receipt of high revenues from non-domestic rates, as opposed to councils in receipt of low revenues, that's already taken into account in the funding formula. And fundamentally, there'd be no change to that. The only change would be that councils would be able to set their own rate. So I'd ask Sarah Boyack to support Amendment 9, because if we don't make a commitment to do this change, then it will probably be 20 years before we can revisit this question. Yeah.
Just briefly, it's to Graham Simpson's point, and Kenny Gibson's as well, that simple things like whether or not setting rates at council level would exacerbate income inequalities, for example, with wealthier councils being able to raise more and poorer councils being able to raise less. Was that identified in the consultation response? And do you think that all of these potential unintended consequences have been thought through sufficiently for us to take this step?
Well, not fully efficiently, but I mean, the question is that the existing funding formula takes account of the fact that some councils have high non-domestic rate revenues, like the City of Edinburgh, for example, and other councils have low ones. So the current funding formula already takes account of that. All this is doing is saying that the rate setting shall be done by the councils to whom this rate belongs. Now, there will be impacts over time, 10, 20 years, in how this power is used, but that's fine. In the same way that all the devolved taxes, we don't consider the impact in the UK as a whole when we set our taxes. Perhaps we should, I don't know. But it's a question of principle that local government should set the rate of taxes that belong to them. Yes.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the member. Just when the member mentioned the question of principle, I mean, I'm finding this process a bit odd because normally, you have discussions amongst relevant stakeholders, they reach an agreement, you then would have a consultation and then you come to legislation and you get the drafting as good as you can possibly get it, as opposed to having a whole series of potential unintended consequences that nobody's looked at in detail. So I'm just very curious as to why you would seek to go about that in completely the reverse order. You would lock in a position, not having dealt with, as you've just admitted, unintended consequences fully, and preempt the discussions that are currently taking place, as the Minister mentioned.
Well, I'm not doing anything in reverse. I mean, I'm seeking to use a legislative opportunity, possibly the only one for another 20 years, to make a change that is broadly supported by many political parties and is a long-standing position of COSLA. And if we don't make that change in primary legislation now, we will not have the opportunity, bar the government introducing legislation at some point in the future, which is no indication that they intend to do. I'll happy to take Sarah Boyack.
Thanks very much. I suppose I'm sitting here thinking, I get the point about this is a huge change and in principle it is the right way to go. What opportunities do we have as a committee though in this process to just pause for breath and get comments before stage 3? Because you've done your own survey, which I think is really useful in terms of informing you, but it doesn't inform the rest of us and we don't see how it worked. I mean, I know in the past when we've had legislation that's complex and difficult, there's been the opportunity for a pause for breath before we hit stage 3. So I'm not trying to argue for or against the principle of what you're trying to do. It is that thing. I think it is totally legitimate for members to come up with important and radical changes. And I know in the past we have bought ourselves extra time. But it just feels to me, without having that equivalence with our local government colleagues being party to this discussion, for those of us who are not in that discussion, then I take your point, it could be another 20 years before we get to this, which is why I'm not arguing against what you're trying to do, because I think this is totally legitimate. But as a committee, do we have scope to have a pause for breath in this? Because I'm looking at several amendments which I think are totally correct, but are actually quite difficult to resolve in the timescale we've got with yeah, convener going to give me a helpful comment there?
We'll see if it's helpful or not. Yeah, I mean, we could have an evidence session between this stage and stage 3 if we thought it was going to be helpful around this area. So there is scope for further evidence to be given, but which might... Yes.
I thought that we would have wanted to have the evidence session before we got to this stage, if this was going to be something that was brought forward. I mean, if we were going to have rabbits plucked out of hats and all that kind of stuff, I mean, what was the point of having all the scrutiny of the bill that we actually had prior to coming to this stage?
Okay. Sorry, back to you, Andy, and I should have...
So I've lost it. Have I just been intervened on twice? I'm lost.
Don't worry about how many times, right?
Am I winding up? Yes, I think I am. So in answer to Sarah Boyack's question, I think the convener has helpfully said, yes, perfectly open to this committee to take further evidence in stage 2 and 3, and that would be, committees have done that in the past. In response to Kenny Gibson's point, obviously we were scrutinising the bill as presented by the government, and as I've argued, the bill seeks to implement the primary legislation that's required to deliver on the Barclay recommendations that the government has decided to implement. The Barclay review was a very, very narrow review, as this committee discovered when it started scrutinising or asking the Barclay, Mr. Barclay himself, prior to the bill coming to Parliament. It was a very narrow review that asked one question. This is the legislative opportunity. It might be the only one for the next 20 years. And in terms of discussions, absolutely, there should be discussions around this. And so there's 2 answers to that. One, this amendment is designed to provide the time to have those discussions and debate. We could do something around commencement, for example. We could adjust the year, 2024. We could adjust it to 2026. The point is, in principle, if we believe that council should have returned to, and this is not a radical change, this is just giving councils back what a centralising government at that time, and I understand Graham Simpson's point that they, with Graham Simpson's presence in the Conservative Party, they've moved on since those days. What they sought in those times was to remove, and I mean, I remember the 1990s, the government was trying to fetter the freedoms of local government on many, many ways, whether it be rate capping or whatever it was. I think, you know, we have moved on from those days. I think parties, generally speaking, understand the need to empower the local state, to give it the kind of responsibility that virtually every single local government system throughout Europe has. This is the opportunity to do it. I'm very mindful that we need to probably address some technical issues around Amendment 9. But if we don't make a commitment to doing this now, yes, happy to do so.
It's just to make a point, really. I mean, I take what the convener said, that the committee could, if it so chose, take some evidence on this. My view is, if this amendment doesn't pass today, the committee won't bother to take evidence. So if it's in the bill, we might. If it's not, we won't. So I guess that's a point directed at Sarah Boyack. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank Graham Simpson for using the opportunity to intervene on Sarah Boyack. And just finally, on a sort of technical question on Amendment 12, I think there might have to be some further amendments to that if members are minded to support it in terms of timescales. But I don't think members are minded to support Amendment 12. So I'll leave things there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In that case, I take it you're pressing.
I'm what, sorry?
Pressing.
Yes, pressing Amendment 9, yes.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 9? Okay, those opposed to Amendment 9, 4 in favour, 3 against. Amendment 9 is agreed to. I call Amendment 10 in the name of Andy Whiteman, already debated with Amendment 9. Andy Whiteman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 14 in the name of Andy Whiteman and a group on its own. Andy Whiteman to move and speak to Amendment 14.
Apologies. Come here. Okay, Amendment 14, which I move. As members will be aware, taxes can be regressive, they can be flat, or they can be progressive. So regressive taxes are where the tax rate falls as the tax base increases in value. So the council tax is a good example of that, where the rate paid by high value properties is proportionately lower than that paid by lower value properties. A flat tax is like VAT, it is one rate. If you're a very wealthy person, you don't pay more VAT than a very poor person. That's one of the reasons why flat taxes and direct taxes are not a terribly good idea, because they end up being regressive in the bigger scheme of things, because poorer people pay more as a proportion of their income in flat taxes. But those are what flat taxes are. VAT at 20%, non-domestic rates at 49 pence, or whatever the rate is currently. Progressive taxes are where the rate increases as the tax base rises, and income tax is a very good example of that. And of course, how progressive one makes it is a matter for political choice. So what this amendment does is that it moves non-domestic rates from being a flat tax to being a progressive tax. And one of the problems about being a flat tax is that if one does want to exempt or relieve low value properties, one has to do it through complex systems of relief, which generally speaking have to be applied for, and all the rest of it. Having a progressive system means you could, for example, have a tax-free allowance. So you could, for example, say that there will be no rates to be charged on the first £10,000 of value or £20,000 of rateable value. That would have the same kind of effect as relief schemes might have, but it'd be simpler to implement. So this amendment is fairly straightforward in principle. It introduces a progressive, by statute, the rates have to be progressive. Now, how progressive, of course, would be set by regulations. As the committee is aware, the negative instrument comes forward each year on setting the rate before Parliament. Similarly, if this amendment were to pass, that instrument would come before Parliament every year, and it would set the figures set out in step 1, 2 and 3. They're really not to be debated as such, because they're merely just a baseline to get started with. They could be amended. The critical point, of course, is that on a year-to-year basis, those figures would be amended in just the same way as when we passed the income tax resolution. We set the rates of income tax in different bands, and we set the thresholds. So there's not much more I need to say. I don't think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. Minister.
Thanks, Convener. On this proposal, properties with a rateable value of less than 60,000 would see their aggregate rates liability fall by £747 million. That means either £750 million being taken directly out of funding for vital local government services, or ratepayers with a rateable value of over 60,000 would need to compensate through higher rates. The non-domestic rates is a property tax, whilst we endeavour to make it as progressive as possible, with the small business bonus scheme protecting those occupying the smallest properties and the large business supplement applying to those occupying the largest properties. There are certain challenges to Mr Whiteman's amendment. So, for example, if you had a very prosperous tech company operating with less rateable value than a bigger high street based premises, you are cutting their rates liability further and increasing the bigger high street based premises, which may have lower turnover, making it higher. So whilst this amendment is certainly better than the previous amendment in this regard, which would have seen the Scottish Parliament building attract rates liability with 43 zeros, it's still putting an iniquitous liability on those occupying the largest properties. And I can't support this amendment as a result.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy, would you like to wind up?
Yes, just in response, I mean, obviously there was a previous amendment to this that had an error in it. And had some entertaining headlines. The principle here that the Minister said that the current system is that her government, the Scottish Government, tries to make this as progressive as possible with things like the Small Business Bonus Scheme, large supplement. I suppose my fundamental point is that's not the way to make a tax system progressive. We don't do that, generally speaking, with income tax. We don't sort of get people to pay it and then give them money back. We do it through a set of bands with thresholds and rates within each threshold. The Minister quoted some figures about the impact of these figures. I've made it very clear that these figures are just a starting point. The actual rate would be set each year. You have to, I mean, we could set these figures X, Y, and Z. And then one wouldn't make any calculations about the impact of them. The calculation of the impact of such a change would be made each year as the rate resolution, as the rate instrument. No, not at the moment. No, as the rate instrument comes forward. So if we can, I understand why the Minister's making that point, but if we can kind of park that because it's not strictly relevant, because these figures are not baked in my view, they're just X, Y, and Z. So I mean, my fundamental point in response to the Minister is that to make a system progressive, I don't think we're going about it the right way at the moment. The easier way to do it is to provide a series of bands, 3 or 4, and set rates that make that progressive and give effect to the same policy intentions as things like the Small Business Bonus Scheme by, for example, making kind of a zero rate band. And her response to it was a high-tech company and the high street and all the rest of it. I mean, those differences exist at the moment because this is a property tax. I understand her point, of course, that would increase the differences. That's what a progressive tax system does. That's an unavoidable...
Take an intervention, sorry.
Yes.
No, it was just one of the things we took in evidence, obviously, was an issue with in actual fact, the Small Business Bonus Scheme itself, which obviously I mentioned when the Minister it came before us. And that's the issue of the cliff edge. And the cliff edge whereby, a lot of businesses are disincentivised to move into larger premises because they then lose the Small Business Bonus Scheme, benefits, and they have to pay higher rates. I'm just wondering how your amendment whether it would help or exacerbate that situation.
Well, that's an important point that Kenny Gibson raises, and it is one of the many, in my view, criticisms of the Small Business Bonus Scheme. I mean, obviously, this amendment sits independently of whether we have such relief schemes. They're in the gift of ministers to bring forward by regulations. So, in a sense, one shouldn't consider this in the context of existing relief schemes. I mean, it's legitimate to do that, but I mean, this is primary legislation. But in principle, a progressive system prevents those cliff edges. Because you don't get the sudden move from 100% relief to only 25 to 0, for example. I mean, in essence, the Small Business Bonus Scheme is designed as a progressive relief system in reverse. It's not progressive enough, if you like, because it still has those cliff edges. You get cliff edges in progressive tax systems as well, but they're not such big cliffs, and you can set the bands and the thresholds such that they're not huge. And as I say, the key value in this is if you do want, as a matter of policy, to relieve properties of, for the sake of argument, below £10,000, the easiest way to do them is to put them into a zero rateable tax band, rather than have a complicated series of reliefs where businesses and ratepayers have to fill out forms and submit them to the council, and the council then has to tell the government how much it's costing, and the government pays them the money. Yes, please.
Just 2 brief points. Obviously, the Small Business Bonus Scheme is subject to a review just now, and I'm coming on to that later with another of the amendments. But the premise of non-domestic rates is that rateable value is based on the notional rental value of a property. Progressivity is linked to ability to pay. So the only way, well, in terms of the example I use, it's just one example where you could have a highly prosperous, very small premises-based tech company paying almost nothing in rates, whereas you would have a business occupying larger premises that may be making far less money and it's far less affordable to them. So it can never be fully progressive in the way that we might imagine it's progressive for income tax. And that is why our relief system just now endeavours to make it as progressive as possible at the edges. But going down this route with a banding system, I think undermines the whole notion of rateable values being based on a notional rental value.
I mean, the valuations would continue to be based. I'm not proposing any changes in the valuation methodology. This is a proposal to change the way in which the rate is structured. And the Minister is correct in terms of, small tech company, she used the example. But that's an issue with the rates at the moment. Indeed, it's an issue with income tax at the moment. I mean, income tax does not take account of the fact that somebody earning, say, £40,000 a year might have 4 children and 2 adults that they're caring for, and much greater household expenditure, whereas someone else earning £40,000, lives on their own and has no dependents at all. So, I mean, all these tax systems are subject to limitations in terms of those who are liable to pay them. The critical point is the design, and the design, I think, in broad terms, we should move away from flat taxes and move to progressive taxes. Well, I've just completed my comments there, so I'll leave it. I'm happy to take an intervention.
Well, I just wondered what financial modelling the member had carried out about the fiscal impacts of this proposal.
Well, there's no fiscal modelling to be done. As I made clear at the outset, these are just baseline figures. They could be X, Y and Z. I don't know why the member's sighing. The actual rate to be set is set by a statutory instrument each year. It's the responsibility of government, who at the moment set rates, to do financial modelling of the impact of their proposals on tax. This merely sets a framework within which, instead of there being a flat tax, there's a progressive tax. As I say, these values could be X, Y and Z. I'm not proposing our rate. The rates would be proposed on an annual basis. I'm providing a framework within which the rate shall be set. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr Whiteman, and I'm happy to move on to ask if you're going to press or withdraw.
I press.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Those in favour of Amendment 14? 1. Those opposed? 6. Amendment 14 therefore is not agreed to. I call Amendment 13 in the name of Graham Simpson and a group on its own. Graham Simpson to move and speak to Amendment 13.
Thanks, Convener. I'll move Amendment 13. This relates to the large business supplement. And it actually follows on from a recommendation which was contained in the Barclay Review, which suggests that in order to make Scotland the most competitive part of the UK to do business, that the rate should be aligned with England. Large business supplements currently paid by all property with a rateable value over 51,000. The rate in Scotland is currently 2.6 pence, while in England it's 1.3. And the Barclay Review said that they believe it should be reduced so it's in line with the rate set in England. They said, and I'm quoting directly from their report, our decision to recommend the supplement is reduced is in the context of current Scottish Government policy to ensure that Scotland is the best place to do business in the UK. Several consultation responses raised the issue of the rate of the large business supplement. Most noted the difference with England. In talking to ratepayers and business groups, we've noted a widely held perception that the difference in large business supplement means that Scotland is not as competitive a place for business as England currently is. A large majority of the tax base, in terms of tax revenue received at least, sees their bills determined by a higher tax rate in Scotland than they do in England. Convener, the Scottish Retail Consortium have said of this amendment, of the 22,000 premises affected by this supplement, some 23% are retailers, costing these retailers alone £13.95 million extra annually. This higher rate makes it more expensive to operate on our high streets and retail destinations and raises the hurdle for attracting commercial investment. This amendment appears to seek to place a cap on the large business rate supplement, well it does, so that it's no higher than that which applies down south. The amendment, I'm just closing, the amendment's also backed by the Scottish Wholesale Association and CBI Scotland. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Annabelle.
Yes, absolutely. to intervene, but the member didn't want to take the intervention. So I just was very curious, because this would appear to me that we are here in this devolved Scottish Parliament actually saying on a particular issue that is devolved, no, we don't want this power, thank you very much anymore. We're going to hand back this power to set maximum thresholds on this particular matter to the Westminster Parliament. I find that absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, I think it's a complete nonsense. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a strong argument for reducing the level of supplement. Of course there is, but it may be that future Scottish governments wish to do it, or this one wishes to do that. It may want to increase it, but that depends on Scottish circumstances. It shouldn't be tied to basically what they do south of the border. So, I mean, that's the whole premise of devolution. So, I mean, on that basis alone, I would certainly oppose this amendment. Andy?
Yes, I mean, this is not handing powers back to Westminster. Past this amendment, we've still got the power to change it in the future. I mean, my problem with this amendment is twofold. I mean, one, we do have things like the large business supplement, which are subject to secondary legislation in terms of the rate it sets. And that means that it's subject to scrutiny by Parliament on a periodic basis. And indeed, my understanding is that ministers can introduce other supplements if they wish by regulation, and that's a flexibility in the system. So in a sense, I think as a matter of principle, it's a poor idea to set out in primary legislation a kind of a constraint like this, particularly a constraint that's tied to the legislative provisions in another jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, sir.
Yeah. For me as well, this is what's the point of devolution? This is the choice that we should make in Scotland. We should have a debate about this. It shouldn't go on the face of the bill. And I do take Graham's point about the pressure in retail, but I think one of the things we're not really looking at is the issue of online retail and a fairer tax system there. And this decision would not actually solve that for us.
Okay, thank you very much. Minister?
Thanks. What, of course, Barclay did not recommend was giving control over the large business supplement cap over to the UK government. And who knows what might happen after the 12th of December? Who knows what we will be connected and linked to going forward? And I think that highlights the core principle and the problem with this, that while Barclay did call for the reduction of the large business supplement when it was affordable, and the Scottish Government committed to that, I would not support tying our tax policies, particularly over something like the large business supplement cap, to UK government decisions in that regard. And so from that point of view, I can't support Mr Simpson's call for the control of a maximum threshold to be handed to the UK government. And in fact, his amendment would restrict it to the rate set by local authorities to fund local economic development projects. But these are matters that should be controlled in Scotland, not set according to whatever rates are set or not set south of the border.
Okay. Mr Simpson, would you like to wind up?
Yeah, well, I certainly appear to have wound up Miss Ewing, not for the first time, and others. Convener, this is not about handing back power to Westminster. Of course, it's not, and members are aware of that. But having heard the comments around the table, I think the point has been made that we don't want Scotland to be uncompetitive with the rest of the UK. This is probably a matter for, it's probably a budgetary matter and not a matter for this bill, so I won't press.
Thank you. Graham Simpson wishes to withdraw his amendment. Does any member present have any objection to the amendment being withdrawn? No. In that case, the amendment is withdrawn. I call Amendment 39 in the name of Alexander Stewart, grouped with Amendment 88. Alexander Stewart to move Amendment 39 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you. I'm content to move Amendment 39. And the reason behind this is for the amendment to bring additional scrutiny and additional transparency to the valuation process. While the non-domestic rate system predates devolution, there is a strong argument that members of the Scottish Parliament should have a role within this system. The Bartlett Review itself urged Scottish assessors to improve and standardise their processes towards ratepayers, and ministers have been keen to highlight that the bill will not deliver as it should, specifically in relation to a more frequent revaluation cycle without administrative reforms. An annual report collated by ministers and presented to the Scottish Parliament would give MSPs an opportunity to scrutinise the operation of the non-domestic rate system, and that itself, convener, would bring additional scrutiny in the operation of the rate system itself. So I'm happy to move 39.
Thank you very much. Sarah Boyack to speak to Amendment 88 and the other amendment in the group.
Thank you very much, convener. Well, I've got a very similar approach to the member there about the importance of additional scrutiny, reporting back to Parliament. I had reflected on the issue and thought that 3 years would probably be more appropriate. I think there are issues that came up in our Stage 1 report about pressures on the system. We've obviously got a new piece of legislation that we're dealing with, and there may be additional issues that would come through from that legislation. So I had thought that in terms of ensuring report back from assessors and capacity and numbers, a Scottish Government input to actually collate that information and present it to the Parliament would be good in terms of transparency. And I picked the 3 years as a more proportion. I hadn't seen Alexander's amendment when I put mine in, but I was thinking 3 years would be appropriate to give us a bit of time to actually look at the impact of this legislation and make it a priority for our committee or others to actually look at the issue. Thank you, convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy?
These are a couple of useful amendments which raise some useful points. I just want to preface what I want to say by reminding the committee, of course, that valuers are professionals and they undertake their valuations as professionals and on the basis of professional standards. And it is a little bit of a concern of mine. If you go to the Scottish Assessors website, of course, you can see the practice notes that they adopt in terms of how they value everything from crematoria to nurseries to bowling greens and however any other properties they value. And some of the issues that certainly come before this Parliament or some of the concerns that members have do actually relate fundamentally to valuation methodologies rather than any kind of policy of the Scottish Government or any legislative provisions. And I'm certainly persuaded that it would be useful on a periodic basis, not annually, I don't think, but certainly on a periodic basis, to make it a statutory requirement that valuation boards provide a report to be laid before Parliament, which would, amongst other things, flag up issues, problems and all the rest of it. And I think whilst that is probably feeding through to government at the moment, I don't know, but one presumes it is, it's not there and visible for members, and I think that would be helpful. In relation to the two amendments, I'm not clear, and Alexander Stewart could reflect on this in winding up, on what 39 is actually doing, because it says a duty to report as soon as practical at the end of each financial year on the effectiveness of the valuation process. Well, it's not clear to me how you assess the effectiveness of the valuation process. If I was a valuer, I'm a professional, and I complete the valuation, I presume I would submit a report saying, well, it was effective. I mean, it's not clear what's being sought in that, and perhaps Mr. Stewart can come back on that. In terms of 88, Sarah Boyack, this is actually really not similar. This is really rather different. I mean, this is a report that is only restricted under subsection 1 to a report to Scottish ministers on the number of assessors and deputy assessors holding office. So it's a pretty straightforward report. There's 10 and 2 or whatever. So I think this is a bit of overkill, really. And then there's a bit in subsection 2b, which it says that Scottish ministers must then lay a report before Parliament that collates these reports and considers whether there are sufficient assessors to enable the fulfilment of the legislative functions of assessors insofar as they relate to non-domestic rates. Well, of course, assessors are not just doing non-domestic rates, they're doing council tax and they're doing maintaining the voters' roll. So I'm not entirely clear what both these amendments are specifically trying to do, but I did preface my remarks, and I would confirm that I think there is merit in valuation boards laying a report before Parliament maybe every 3 or 5 years that gives them the opportunity to discuss and highlight issues that have arisen in the valuation process, and I think it would be beneficial to members. But neither of these two amendments really do that.
Okay, thank you, Graham.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I think, but these amendments are doing different things, but they're essentially all about one thing, and that is about transparency. So a duty to report on two different things, I'm certainly happy to support both amendments. I think probably do need a bit of work, and what I would say to Mr. Stewart and Ms. Boyack is maybe they should get their heads together if these go through for stage 3 and come up with something jointly.
Point.
Yeah.
I would be certainly happy to do that, and I take the point that both you and Andy Whiteman have made, and I'd also be happy to work with the Minister as well, if we were happy to get these amendments pushed through, that we could come back and take a final view on it. But I think the issue is transparency and proportionality, so I appreciate your comment.
Okay. Well, I'll finish on that note.
Thank you. Minister.
Thanks, Convener. My thoughts initially here were that the Scottish Government was being drawn into matters that are best left to local authorities to review and determine. But I think that there's merit, particularly in Sarah Boyack's amendment. I appreciate Alexander Stewart's amendment, but I think that on balance, I would support Sarah Boyack's amendment and not Alexander Stewart's. I would be happy to meet with both individuals to work and adjust on the amendment that goes through. And I think it is important, though, to identify that the role of assessors are professionals, they are independent, they carry out evaluations in accordance with the law, and they're independent of government, which has no remit, nor should it, to intervene in that process. And the process of evaluation is obviously extremely complex as well and technical, and should remain under the purview of rating experts, surveyors and solicitors. I think there's also a point too, and this is why on balance I would support Sarah Boyack's amendment, that I don't think it's necessary to be annual. I think that is a considerable amount of work with very little gain, but a 3-yearly process is probably more relevant to the nature of non-domestic rates. So on balance would support Sarah Boyack's, but I think if both members are willing to work with me, we could do something here to adjust them and fine-tune them.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah? Oh, it's Alexander Stewart, sorry. My apologies.
Thank you, Convener. I think it's been a useful discussion that we've just had with references, but my core at the end of the day was to bring additional scrutiny and transparency to the process. And that, I think, is very valuable for us to have that. And Bartley did indicate that that was what was trying to, and I do appreciate that the professionalism of the assessors is taken into this whole process. So I do think that there is merit in looking at this, and I hear what the Minister's saying, and I also acknowledge the information that Sarah Boyack has brought together, that there should be a time for this to take place. So I'm quite live to the discussion we've had, and I'm more than happy to have further discussions as we progress this, if that is the case, so that we get some transparency and we get some scrutiny within this process, so that the Scottish Parliament does have a role and MSPs do have an input in this whole process, because I think that's what would be expected of us.
Can I ask you if you're going to press or withdraw your own amendment, Alexander?
So I will withdraw.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alexander Stewart wishes to withdraw his amendment. Does any member present have any objection to the amendment being withdrawn? Okay, thank you very much. The amendment is therefore withdrawn. The question, I call Amendment 88 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 39. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Not move, with the approach of coming back at stage 3 on the basis that the Minister and cross-party support is there for it to come back.
Okay, thank you. I call Amendment 3 in the name of Andy Whiteman and a group on its own. Andy Whiteman to move and speak to Amendment 3.
Thanks, Convener. I move Amendment 3. The Barclay Review in its annexes contains a number of issues that Barclay looked at but didn't end up making formal recommendations in the main report. And one of these was contained in C7, section C7, entitled Ensuring that Every Ratepayer Pays Something. So again, this comes to a matter of principle, one of accountability. Barclay describes what he calls rates deserts, locations where no one contributes anything to the running and delivering the public services that the owners and occupiers of property depend on, the roads, to bring their customers and make deliveries, the amenities that enhance property values, the planning, the infrastructure that enables housing for their workers. So the principle that everyone should pay something, albeit a modest amount, I think is an important principle in building that link between non-domestic property occupiers and the councils whose services they rely on. And when you have relief schemes introduced, and again, relief schemes are out with the, they're separate from all this, but if the effect of relief schemes, such as small business bonus, is to take thousands and thousands of people out of a system and pay nothing whatsoever, then that, in my view, begins to undermine the important relationship of accountability that's existed for, well over a century between non-domestic property occupiers and the local authority, as I say, upon whose services they rely. So this amendment is called a mandatory minimum payment, and it doesn't seek to eliminate any relief schemes or anything like that, although its effect would be to adjust the 100% relief available under small business bonus scheme to a 97.5% relief. That would be the effect of it. But ensures that every ratepayer will pay something. I mean, at the moment it's set at 2.5% of the value of lands and heritages. So a property with a valuation of, say, £10,000 a year would be liable for 250. Now, of course, exactly how you set this, it could be a flat rate, well open to debate. I'm more interested in discussion around the principle of this, which I, of course, would advocate. I think it's an important principle in the rate system, and this amendment gives effect to it. Thanks, Convener.
Graham?
Yeah. So Andy Whiteman mentioned relief schemes, and I think it certainly would meddle with the relief schemes. So the small business bonus scheme, where some businesses don't pay anything, Andy Whiteman is suggesting that everyone should pay something. I think this is too fundamental a change that he's suggesting. I think there's, it'll be a massive change to the system to introduce this, and could actually be damaging to some businesses. So I wouldn't be supportive of it.
Thank you. Annabelle?
Yes, I would agree with that. I'm a supporter of the small business bonus scheme. I know from my constituency absolutely what difference it makes from shops being able to continue in existence or not. And given the state of high streets that committee has already referred to on many different occasions in many different contexts, I don't think that this would help the high street. I think this would be of damage to the high street. I don't know what modelling, again, has been conducted by Mr Whiteman. He didn't refer to anything specifically, but I would not support this amendment, Convener.
Yes, I concur. I think this would be really detrimental to a number of businesses within our high streets. We should be doing all we can to encourage, support and flourish and rejuvenate those locations within our communities and our constituencies. This would be a real burden and could jeopardise any opportunity of seeing developments and the move forward within the business community. So I could not support it, Convener.
Yeah, I think once upon a time this would actually have been quite a good suggestion, but we're many years past that date. I think the retail sector in particular is under severe pressure. I think it's the wrong measure at the wrong time. Also, I think we have to consider that it would impact on charities and others. I just think that, given the point that Sarah made earlier about online retailing, it would only exacerbate the advantage of online retailers over high street retailers, and therefore I would oppose this amendment.
Okay. Minister?
Create a rates liability for over 142,000 properties. And I'm very supportive of the small business bonus scheme. I see its impact on a ministerial level, but also on a constituency level in terms of enabling small businesses in particular to reinvest. I think it's perfectly legitimate to have questions around the small business bonus scheme, to question whether it's achieving its aim of revitalising local economies. But that's why, of course, this summer we commissioned the Fraser Allender Institute to review the small business bonus scheme, as it's accepted that there are improvements that can be made to the scheme to ensure that it supports small business. And I think it would be wise to wait the outcome and the recommendations of that independent review rather than consider the imposition of a minimum rates liability on the properties benefiting from this scheme. There is, of course, other rates relief schemes in operation. So, for example, the Business Growth Accelerator Relief, which encourages investment in the property stock, and or 100% relief for telecoms masts to encourage improvements in digital connectivity in Scotland. So all of these areas would then be subjected to a rates liability, which, you know, the reason these reliefs exist is to incentivise investment and to support particular policy decisions, such as supporting high streets and small businesses on those high streets. So in that vein, I don't support this amendment.
Thank you. Andy, to wind up, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. I'm slightly bemused by committee members' responses to this, including the claim that this is a massive change. This is an incredibly minor change to the rating system. And as I made clear at the outset, this is about a principle of accountability. The Minister talks about the small business bonus review and wanting to wait. Well, again, you wait. That ship has sailed. This legislation has passed. We don't have another legislative opportunity to put in place the principle here that every ratepayer should pay something. Now, I'm not a fan of the small business bonus scheme the way it's designed. Some of the wealthiest people on the planet owning land in Scotland are paying nothing as a consequence of this. And I know in Lothian region there are plenty of premises where the thresholds have gone up. The premises have become vacant and been let again at a higher rent because the occupiers paying no more than they were before. And so the problem is it gets capitalised into the value of the property for the owner. And that's always the problem when you relieve fixed assets like property of a liability to pay tax, is it ends up being incorporated into the rent anyway, and you enrich the owner. But notwithstanding that, there's a review going on, and I agree with the Minister, we need to wait for the outcome of that review. But I do not think this amendment is related directly to that review. Whether there should be reliefs or not is a question as to whether there should be reliefs or not. What I'm proposing is that there should be a minimum payment that everyone should pay to remind themselves on an annual basis that they depend upon the services of local government. So that simple principle I'm putting in play. With respect to Annabel Ewing's point about the impact, the figures were given by Barclays would raise about £30 million. I mean, I just don't think that paying £250 a year for a property valued at £10,000 is going to, break the bank. And if anyone's got an issue with that, obviously you can't set this far too low, otherwise the principle might be being observed, but the administrative costs outweigh the cost of collection would outweigh the revenue being generated. So I'm very open to how one expresses that value, but I'm more keen, I'm more interested in the principle itself. Thanks, Convener.
Press or withdraw? Andy?
Press.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
Okay, those in favour? That's 1. And those opposed? 6. Amendment 3 is not agreed to. Thank you. I call Amendment 89 in the name of Sarah Boyack and a group on its own. Sarah Boyack to move and speak to Amendment 89.
Thank you very much, Convener. The Business Growth Accelerator reduces rates of businesses which have invested in improvements. It's been applied differently across Scotland, and one of the things I wanted to do with this amendment is to highlight what the different ways in which it's implemented are actually put into practice. So I was looking for something for a requirement for the Scottish ministers to give greater clarity, partly to encourage people to use this, and to raise more awareness both on the local authority and the business side as to how Business Growth Accelerator works. So the amendments are really about providing more clarity, providing more awareness about it, and raising the profile of the Business Growth Accelerator. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Any other members wish to speak? No, Minister?
Thanks, Convener. If I could, I identify my current concern, but then offer Sarah Boyack the opportunity to again consider in advance of stage 3. We agree that relief should be accompanied by appropriate guidance for councils and ratepayers alike. We currently publish non-statutory guidance for all reliefs, which is compiled with the involvement of officers from COSLA and the Institute of Revenues Rating and Valuation, and it's regularly updated. And the complexities of the Business Growth Accelerator relief in particular, which of course all of this amendment relates to, lies in the identification of eligible properties, which actually goes back to a previous amendment I had. And that's why we introduced section 3 of the bill, which provides for assessors to mark the valuation role for newly built and improved lands and heritages. Assessors operate independently of ministers, and it's a matter for them to interpret and to apply valuation legislation. We've got no locus to either intervene in the process or to issue guidance to assessors. So section 9 allows the Scottish ministers to make regulations creating relief for newly built and improved lands and heritage. The mark is there to provide councils with a means of identifying the properties that will be eligible for relief. The intention is that those regulations will specify amounts and durations of relief. I'm open to be persuaded that there is a need for statutory guidance to be issued to local authorities in this scenario. It's more unusual in how we would approach guidance for other reliefs, for example, bearing in mind the important distinction between governments intervening and the independence of assessors. So whilst I couldn't support Sarah Boyack's amendment as it stands, I think there's probably some points that could be further explored around how we issue guidance with perhaps a more nuanced amendment.
If no other colleagues have got a comment, then I'd be happy not to move at this stage and to come back at stage 3 following those discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Once the Minister's spoken, it's back to you to wind up. So no other comment. Right, okay. Sarah Boyack wishes to withdraw her amendment. Does any member present have any objection to the amendment being withdrawn? Thank you. The amendment has therefore been withdrawn. The question therefore is that section 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yep. Thank you. I call Amendment 90 in the name of Sarah Boyack, grouped with Amendments 91 and 92. Sarah Boyack to move Amendment 90 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. These amendments are intended to address 2 of the major challenges of the day. Firstly, the climate emergency that we're facing, and secondly, the challenge of encouraging businesses to adopt business strategies that would be good for our economy. In fact, if you look at the Scottish Government's programme for government, you could take the Greener, Fairer Scotland tag as being what these are attempting to do. We do need a much more joined-up government, and that includes how we craft and implement our tax policies. So Amendment 90 aims to encourage the owner, company or tenant to be more sustainable and gives examples of how they could do this in order to gain an incentive with a reduced NDR payment. Not arguing that businesses would automatically be exempt from payment, but that they could at the very least be offered a discount. And further, I've left it to the Scottish Government to determine the discount and the scheme. So I've listed the following potential business practices: reducing waste, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, procuring goods which are produced locally to lands and heritage, and environmentally sustainable. And I've also included the use of energy from zero emission sources, as well as energy saved through energy efficiency measures. I then provided for the Scottish Government to produce regulations to detail how the regulations would be implemented. This would include for the periods for which relief is available and eligibility. So this would mean, for example, that it could be determined that this would be available for the next 5 or 10 years, thinking about the climate emergency to stimulate action, or it could be longer. Again, that would be up for the government to consider the detail. But I've also proposed that the regulations would be subject to affirmative resolution so that they're given full consideration by the Parliament. In relation to Amendment 91, I've set out the proposal for positive business practices which would qualify for rates relief. I've suggested that positive business practices could include not using zero-hours contracts, the payment of a living wage, and practices which would have a positive effect on the local economy and environment, the use of district heating. Amendment 92 would add in the contribution to net zero emissions target, including through investment in district heating. Now, I've deliberately future-proofed the wording so that other zero-carbon investment that would achieve those aims could be covered. I'm very conscious that promoting low-carbon heat is currently a key objective, but there might be a range of alternative technologies and approaches being developed in the future. Now, I'd make the point that although we have innovative low-carbon heat networks in Scotland, they've been very slow to get off the ground, they are very expensive to construct, they don't make huge profit, particularly if they're providing heat that businesses and households can afford to use. And there are major disincentives faced by local authorities in attempting to promote heat networks, specifically because of non-domestic rates. Now, this issue was raised by, interestingly, a Glasgow SNP councillor who identified the fact that district heating systems have clear potential to deliver cheaper, cleaner energy into people's homes, but that the current system, the local tax system, acts as a deterrent to them being used more widely. And she said that under present rules, installing district heating systems brings in significant new non-domestic rates, and that adds unduly to the cost of heating homes. She made comments about the Commonwealth Games. They had a specific rates rebate agreed by the government, but she said until heating systems are competitive with conventional gas heating, we won't be able to move forward. We need the government to cut through this problem if district heating systems are to contribute to the city's drive to achieve carbon neutrality. I don't think that's just an issue in Glasgow. I think it's a cross-Scotland issue. So I hope colleagues will support these amendments. They do address issues at the forefront of the challenges we face in Scotland, and they provide incentives to deliver the challenge we need, not in a generation but now. And crucially, they're crafted to give the ministers flexibility as to how they would take this forward. Thank you, Convener. I move number 90 in my name.
Okay, thank you. Andy and then Graham.
Thanks. I mean, just a couple of brief comments. I mean, I've got a lot of sympathy with the intention behind these two amendments. Just a couple of points. First of all, I think ministers already have the power to introduce reliefs and design relief schemes if they so wish, and were they to be minded to propose relief schemes along these lines, they would have that power just now, but maybe the minister can address that point. But notwithstanding that, there's always some benefit in drawing specific attention to ministers' powers to achieve certain things, to encourage them to do so. The second, though, is Sarah Boyack talked about the flexibility in terms of the rates of relief, the periods and the eligibility, and that'll be absolutely critical because, I mean, ultimately, say, under Amendment 90, we do want everyone to reduce waste, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, procuring goods more environmentally stable. That's something we want everyone to do. So if this relief was granted on the successful achievement of all that, there'd be no rates paid by anybody. Public revenues would fall. The rates bill for this Parliament, for example, would arguably just collapse because we have reduced waste, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and do local procurement and all the rest of it. So that's not an argument against this scheme. It's a point to be made actually to strengthen Sarah Boyack's point that designing this is going to have to be very careful because it's going to have to be an incentive to achieve certain outcomes, which after they're achieved means that the relief is withdrawn. And as we just kind of discussed around small business bonus scheme, once you introduce a relief and people are paying 50% less tax or indeed no tax, it's politically extremely challenging to then say, well, actually now you're going to pay it. So those are just some observations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Graham.
Thanks, Convener. So I'll speak to each of these, I think. So Amendment 90, I think it's a very positive idea that we could have rates relief if you do things like reduce waste, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, etc. We'd all support that. But I take Andy Whiteman's point that you could end up in a situation of people doing all these things and then ending up paying nothing. Everybody pays nothing. However, the amendment does say that ministers should do this through regulations. So I think it's one of these amendments that is good, but probably does need some more work. I think at this point we could support it on that proviso. The same cannot be said of Amendment 91, which deals the same idea around positive business practices. Now, my issue with this is how on earth do you define positive business practice? What is a positive business practice to Sarah Boyack? may not be a positive business practice to me. And she lists a few things in her amendment, and actually it's quite a bizarre mix. You've got 0 hours contracts to the use of district heating. Now, you know, 0 hours contracts, the members will have different views on that. But places like ski centres in Scotland would say, well, we need those. We need 0 hours contracts. So for them, it's a positive business practice. To Sarah Boy, it clearly isn't. So I think there are issues with 91, so couldn't support that. 92, I think, falls into basically the same category as 90. So we'd be happy to go along with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Annabelle?
I mean, I'm interested by the approach of Sarah Boyack on this. I just see, from a very practical perspective, a number of difficulties, and it goes back to this approach of using the stage 2 here to come up with all this stuff without really any detailed consultation and working through these issues carefully and comprehensively and just tagging them onto stage 2. I have concerns with that because a whole host of questions arise to me. And fairness, what is fairness? Fairness for whom? And also, who's assessing all this compliance? And what's the machinery for that? And what is the impact of that? And is council, and what's the money behind that? And all the rest of it. And these are really, you know, this is not a bad idea. But my question rather is simply that I don't think that this tagging it on here at this stage without all this work being done is the best way to go about this, because this will have absolutely detailed implications for people trying to run a business, particularly small businesses. And I don't really think it's a very fair way to proceed to just launch this without particularly the Federation of Small Business and others having had an opportunity to make a detailed response. So I would find it very difficult at this stage to support the amendments in the current form.
Minister.
Thanks, Peter. I'll speak to all of the amendments as the principles I'll identify are relevant to each of them. I don't think anybody would dispute the sentiment behind these amendments, and indeed to Andy Whiteman's point, the government already uses non-domestic rates to support renewables, including through district heating relief, so that's 60% relief, and 60% relief for small-scale hydro schemes and relief for renewable energy generation where there is a community interest. And those reliefs are unique or more generous than any equivalent reliefs in the UK. We are, of course, a strong proponent of fair work, including the living wage, which the government supports through the Scottish Business Pledge to encourage fair practices for all businesses. And of course, we have the new legally binding annual targets for climate change that were in the climate change bill earlier this year to set a 2045 target for net zero emissions. So it's important that we look at every aspect and how we are going to support those ambitions. But I don't believe that using non-domestic rates, which of course, as has already been said, is a property-based tax and primary legislation, is the best way to address our wider ambitions. It would be, apart from anything else, hugely burdensome, impractical and open to abuse. I don't take an amendment.
So I thank Minister for taking intervention. Could you just clarify, just as a matter of law, whether I'm correct in arguing that ministers already have the powers, if they so wish to do this, for the sake of argument, if they wish to do this, whether they already have the powers in existing legislation to introduce relief along those lines?
Yes, I mean, we have already got the powers to create reliefs along those lines and other lines that we wish, and that's where, when I opened in terms of talking about district heating relief and the small hydro scheme relief. The other element to all of this, of course, but I know the committee members have already expressed frustration when I talk about reviews that are further down the line, but we have committed to a review of plant and machinery with a particular focus on renewable energy sector valuations, and that I would expect would explore a number of the concerns in detail and will have proposals to make in terms of how we support renewable energy through reliefs or otherwise. Non-domestic rates reliefs are typically administered on the basis of objective, evidence-based characteristics of a property, such as its rateable value or the purpose for which it's being occupied. And an example is the small business bonus scheme, which is based primarily on rateable value, whereas nursery or charity relief requires the property to be used wholly or mainly as a charity or nursery. And there are some reliefs that are location-based, but even they are based upon objective facts and they're known and evidence. So, to come to Graham Simpson's point and Annabel Ewing's point, to administer reliefs on the basis of a subjective or transitory feature of the property or occupier, such as positive business practices or sustainable business practices, would increase the administrative burden substantially, and the concepts are ultimately subjective, so that even if councils were able to gather information on such practices, which could be potentially at significant cost and time, there would be different interpretations across the councils. So councils would need to be significantly resourced to increase their policing, because otherwise those provisions would be ripe for abuse. So an occupier could, for example, procure local goods on a day that they applied for and were assessed for the relief, and source them from sweatshops the rest of the year, that they would still be eligible. And similarly, they could provide evidence of meeting the living wage at a point in time, and then council would struggle to both verify that evidence and to monitor it over time. So I could go into further detail on an operational level, because businesses would be required to provide evidence on their practices to councils on a very frequent basis, and those considerations would need to be assessed and costed, and local authorities consulted on the implications for workload. So, you know, I would like to think that we are trying to address some of Sarah Boyack's concerns through alternative measures that are already in place, but I cannot support those amendments for the reasons that I have highlighted and outlined.
Okay, thanks, Minister. Sarah Boyack, to wind up, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. Well, I appreciate colleagues' comments, but nobody's really disputed the fact that we need to act. And as I understand it, the evidence is out there that when people are putting in district heating systems, for example, they are having non-domestic rates applied, which puts people off developing them. The Minister in her comments there made about the second amendment I've put in about progressive business practices. She said you could, on one day, pay the living wage and not do that for the rest of the year. But there are already schemes where people sign up to being living wage employers which don't let them sign up for a day. So I think there are alternative ways that you could demonstrate that you've done this that would not be time consuming on councils and would be possible to apply. So I think I've not really heard why the objectives behind these amendments are wrong. I think they do address two of the key issues of the day in terms of fairer and greener businesses, and I think they're practical, and for those reasons I would like to push them.
Okay, thank you very much. The question is then that Amendment 90 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 90? 3. Those opposed? 3. 4. Amendment 90 is not agreed to. So I call Amendment 91 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 90. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 91 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 91? 1. Those opposed? 6. Amendment 91 is not agreed to. I call Amendment 92 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 90. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 92 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
No. Okay. Those in favour of Amendment 92? 4. Those opposed? Amendment 92 is agreed to. 4-3. Okay. Yep. I call Amendment 11 in the name of Andy Whiteman, already debated with Amendment 9. Andy Whiteman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 12 in the name of Andy Whiteman, already debated with Amendment 9. Andy Whiteman, to move or not move?
I think not moved, because I think the main one fell, didn't it? So there's no point in this.
That's right.
Thanks for confirming that. Yes, no.
Okay, thank you. At this stage, I think this is an appropriate point to conclude today's meeting. The next section would be taking up a considerable amount of time, and I want to apologise to Liz Smith, but we thought we'd get here a bit earlier than we did. And because of other circumstances, we would have to finish this session at 11:45. So I just don't think we'd be able to give the next section enough due diligence. So I'm now going to move the session into private. Sorry, that concludes today's meeting. Any remaining amendments to parts of the bill not reached today should be lodged by 12 noon tomorrow. I'll move the session into private and wait for the witnesses and public to leave.